Hey guys! Tonight we begin a journey into one of the most terrifying New Year's traditions you have never heard of. Imagine this. It is midnight on December the 31st, 1872. You are standing in your Victorian home, heart pounding in your chest as your hand trembling on the doorknob, and you are absolutely terrified. Why? Because you know that if you open that door at the wrong moment, if you say the wrong words, if the wrong person steps through first, your entire family will be cursed for 365 days, every single day of the new year. Poverty, sickness, maybe even death. This is not fiction, this is not a horror story. This was real life for millions of Victorian families. And tonight, I'm going to show you exactly what terrified them and why. Because what they feared at that threshold might just change the way you think about your own front door forever. Now, before we step through that threshold together, I need to tell you something. If you are lying in bed right now, maybe in California, maybe in Texas, maybe in London or Sydney, listening to this story unfold in the darkness, I want you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button, not because I am asking you to, but because you genuinely want to know what happens next. Give this video a like if you feel that curiosity building. And here is what I really want to know. Drop a comment right now telling me where you are and what time it is. Are you in your bedroom with the lights off, on a night shift somewhere, driving home, taking a break from work? I genuinely want to know who I am sharing this story with tonight, because we're about to spend the next 11 minutes together, and then many more after that, diving deep into the strangest, darkest, most fascinating New Year's superstitions that once gripped entire societies with fear. So get comfortable. Dim those lights if you have not already. Maybe turn on a fan for some gentle background sound. Let the world fade away for a while. And let me take you back to a time when midnight was not just a celebration, but a moment of absolute terror. Picture this, it is New Year's Eve in Victorian England. The year could be 1850, 1870, 1890. It does not matter, because for over 70 years the same ritual played out in thousands of homes across Britain. As the clock approached midnight, families would gather near their front doors, but they were not gathering to celebrate, they were gathering to protect themselves. Victorians believed that midnight on New Year's Eve was not just a change of date on the calendar, it was a crack in reality itself. A moment when the veil between the physical world and the spiritual world grew dangerously thin. When ghosts could slip through, when demons could enter, when your entire year's fate could be sealed by a single wrong move. The front door, the threshold of your home, became the most dangerous spot in the entire house. So what did they do? The ritual began at exactly midnight. The head of the household would position himself at the front door, his family standing behind him, often holding hands, sometimes praying silently. Children were instructed to remain absolutely quiet, because noise at the wrong moment could attract malevolent spirits. Then, at the stroke of 12, as church bells rang out across the town, the father would fling the door wide open, not gently, but violently, dramatically, with force, and the entire family would shout together, "Welcome, welcome, welcome to the new year." But they were not just welcoming the new year, they were performing an act of spiritual warfare. The shouting was meant to startle and drive away evil spirits lurking near the threshold. The sudden opening of the door was meant to let good fortune rush in before darkness could settle. And the repetition 3 times, that was rooted in ancient Celtic traditions, where 3 was considered a sacred number with protective power. Now here is where it gets even stranger. After shouting their welcome, the father would take a cake or loaf of bread that had been specially prepared earlier on that day, and he would hurl it against the inside of the door with all his strength. The cake would shatter, crumbs would fly everywhere, and the family would watch anxiously to see how it broke apart. Why? Because this was not just about making a mess. This was a spell, a ritual designed to ensure that hunger would not enter the home in the coming year. The logic went like this. If you could destroy food at your threshold, it meant you had so much abundance that you could afford to waste it. And that display of abundance would, theoretically, attract more abundance throughout the year. But there was also a darker interpretation. The violent act of throwing food against the door was also meant to be a sacrifice, an offering to whatever spirits might be watching. Take this food, but leave my family alone. Let us have enough to eat for the next 12 months. Can you imagine the pressure? Can you imagine standing there as a father or mother, knowing that your children were watching, believing that if you did not perform this ritual correctly, they might go hungry? That is the weight Victorian parents carried. But the terror did not end with the cake throwing, because now came the most critical part of the entire night, the part that kept families awake with anxiety, the part that could make or break their entire year. The first footer. The first footer was the first person to cross your threshold after midnight. The first person to step from the outside world into your home in the new year. And Victorians believed with absolute conviction that this person's characteristics would determine your family's fortune for the next 365 days. But here is the thing that made it so terrifying. You could not control who the first footer would be, unless you planned very, very carefully. Let me give you a real example. In 1870, in the town of Mansfield, England, there was a court trial. Yes, an actual legal trial. A young woman was arrested and brought before a judge. Her crime? Walking the streets at 1 o'clock in the morning on New Year's Day. When the judge asked her why she was out at such an inappropriate hour, she explained that she had attended a midnight church service to welcome the new year. She walked home feeling blessed and peaceful, but when she arrived at her own front door, her own mother refused to let her in. Why? Because the young woman had light-coloured hair, and her father and brother, who both had dark hair, had not yet returned home from their celebrations. The mother stood on the other side of that locked door and said through the wood, "You cannot come in. Not yet. Not until your brother or your father arrives first." So this young woman, this daughter who had just been to church to pray for a good year, was forced to stand outside her own home in the cold English winter night for over an hour, waiting, hoping, praying that a male relative with dark hair would arrive before she froze. A mother locking out her own daughter because of the colour of her hair, because of a superstition about the first footer. And this was not an isolated incident. There was another case documented in the same region where a farmer came home after midnight on New Year's Eve. His wife locked the door, refused to let him in. Why? Because he had light hair, reddish hair actually, and she told him, "Find someone with dark hair to come first or we will have bad luck all year." The farmer had to wander around the village in the middle of the night, knocking on doors, trying to find a dark-haired friend or neighbour who would agree to visit his house first. Can you imagine the humiliation? Can you imagine the fear that would drive a wife to lock out her own husband? But why dark hair? Why was hair colour so important? The answer takes us back even further in history, back to the Viking invasions of Britain. For centuries, Vikings with their blonde hair and red beards had raided British villages. They came in their longships, they burned homes, they stole valuables, they killed people. And over time, the British developed a deep psychological association between light hair and danger. A stranger with blonde hair arriving at your door meant trouble. It meant violence. It meant loss. This fear was so deeply embedded in the culture that even 1,000 years later, in the Victorian era, families still carried that ancient trauma. Dark hair, on the other hand, was associated with safety, with locals, with people who belonged to the community. A tall, dark-haired man represented strength and protection. He was the ideal first footer. But it was not just about hair colour. Victorian superstition was far more specific than that. The perfect first footer needed to meet multiple criteria. He had to be male, he had to be tall, he had to have dark hair. He could not be cross-eyed, he could not have flat feet, and in some regions he had to be married, while in others he had to be unmarried. Why all these rules? Because Victorians believed that the first footer's characteristics would literally transfer to the household. A cross-eyed man would bring twisted luck. A flat-footed man would bring a year of stumbling and setbacks. A woman, any woman, would bring the worst possible omens. Some regions believed it would bring death. Others believed it would bring illness, and some believed it would bring financial ruin. This was rooted in ancient fears about feminine power. In Celtic and pagan traditions, there was a figure called the Cailleach. She was a crone goddess of winter and death. She took the form of an old woman, and if she knocked on your door, if she was the first to cross your threshold, it meant doom for everyone inside. That myth never really died, it just evolved. And by the Victorian era, it had become keep all women away from the threshold until a proper man crosses first. Now the first footer did not arrive empty-handed. That would be even worse luck. He had to bring gifts, symbolic gifts, to one representing something the family needed for the coming year. Coal represented warmth, a silver coin represented financial prosperity. Whisky represented good cheer and joy. Salt represented flavour in life and the preservation of health. And bread or shortbread represented food and sustenance. When the first footer arrived carrying these gifts, he would be welcomed inside. The family would exchange pleasantries. They would offer him food and drink in return, and only after he'd been properly honoured could normal life resume. Only then was the threshold considered safe for others to cross. But here is something particularly fascinating and disturbing. Some families were so paranoid about getting the wrong first footer that they would arrange for someone to wait outside before midnight. A trusted male friend or relative with dark hair would be sent outside into the cold before the clock struck 12. He would stand there shivering, waiting for the bells to ring, and the moment midnight arrived, he would knock on the door. The family would let him in, performing the ritual perfectly, ensuring that no random stranger could accidentally become their first footer. This level of control, this level of anxiety, it shows you just how seriously Victorians took this tradition. It was not just a fun superstition, it was not just a quaint custom, it was a matter of survival. At least that is what they believed. And the psychological impact was real. Families who accidentally got the wrong first footer, who had a woman or a light-haired person cross first, would spend the entire year interpreting every bad thing that happened as a result of that mistake. Did the crops fail? It was the first footer's fault. Did someone get sick? The first footer. Did business go poorly? The first footer. It became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because once you believe that your year is cursed, you start to see evidence of that curse everywhere. You become more anxious, you make worse decisions, you take fewer risks, and your life actually does get worse. Not because of any supernatural force, but because of the power of belief itself. Imagine living in an era before modern medicine, before antibiotics, before reliable food supplies, before job security. Your child could die from a simple infection. A bad harvest could mean starvation. Losing your job could mean homelessness. Life was genuinely terrifying in ways we can barely comprehend today. So what did people do? They created rituals. They created rules. They convinced themselves that if they just performed the right actions at the right time, they could protect themselves. They could ward off disaster. They could control fate. And the threshold, that space between inside and outside, between safety and danger, between the old year and the new year, became the ultimate battleground for that control, became the place where families made their stand against an uncertain future. Standing at that doorway on New Year's Eve, shouting welcomes, throwing cakes, Waiting anxiously for the right person to step through first, Victorians were not just following tradition, they were fighting for their lives, or at least they believed they were. And in many ways, that belief shaped their reality just as much as any actual supernatural force could have. So the next time you casually open your front door at midnight on New Year's Eve, the next time you let anyone walk into your home without a second thought, remember this. There was a time when that simple act was considered one of the most dangerous things you could possibly do. A time when the threshold was not just a doorway, but a portal, a gateway, a crack between worlds. But here is the thing, the threshold ritual, that was just the beginning of Victorian New Year's terror. Because once you got the first footer right, once you welcomed the new year properly, you still had to survive the rest of the night. And the rest of the night was when things got even more bizarre, even more dangerous, even more Victorian. What happened after the first footer left? What other rituals did families have to perform? And why did some of those traditions involve actual violence, actual public humiliation, and actual mob justice disguised as celebration? Those questions we're going to explore next. And trust me, what comes next will make the threshold ritual seem almost tame by comparison. So stay with me, keep those lights low, and let us continue this journey together. So we have just talked about the threshold, about that terrifying moment when Victorian families threw open their doors at midnight. But now, let me tell you about what happened next. And this is where the fear became truly personal. This is where the colour of your hair could literally get you banned from your own neighbourhood on the most important night of the year. The first footing tradition was not just some quaint custom, it was an obsession, a mania that gripped Victorian Britain with such intensity that it destroyed friendships, broke apart families, and created a bizarre hierarchy of human worth based entirely on physical appearance. Let me paint you a picture. It is New Year's Eve, 1883, in a small village in Yorkshire, England. A man named Thomas Wright is getting ready for the evening. He is a good man, a kind man. He works at the local mill, attends church every Sunday, never been in trouble with the law. But Thomas has one problem, one characteristic that makes him, in the eyes of his neighbours, a walking curse. Thomas Wright has red hair. Red hair was considered the mark of the devil. Red like fire, red like blood, red like danger. If a red-haired person was the first to cross your threshold on New Year's Day, your house would burn down within the year, or someone in your family would bleed to death, or violence would come knocking at your door. So what happened to Thomas Wright every New Year's Eve? He was ostracised. Starting around 8 o'clock in the evening, people would see him on the street and cross to the other side. Shopkeepers would close their doors when he approached. If he tried to enter a pub for a drink, the landlord would ask him to leave, not rudely, but with genuine fear in their eyes. "Please, Thomas, not tonight, you understand, please." And Thomas did understand, because this had been happening to him every New Year's Eve since he was a child. He would go home, lock his door, sit by his fire alone while the rest of the village celebrated, and he would wait for midnight to pass, wait for the danger period to end. Can you imagine that? Being rejected by your entire community, not because of anything you did, but simply because of the way you were born, the colour of your hair. Thomas was not alone. There were thousands of people across Britain who experienced this same rejection every New Year. Red-haired people, blonde people, light brown hair, even grey hair in some regions. All of them considered unlucky. All of them pushed to the margins of society for one night every year. The hierarchy was incredibly specific. At the top was the tall, dark-haired, dark-eyed man. If you had black hair, brown eyes, and you were over 6 feet tall, you were first-footer royalty. People would pay you to visit their homes. Yes, pay you. Some wealthy Victorian families actually hired professional first-footers, men who met all the criteria and who would make the rounds on New Year's Eve, visiting house after house, collecting fees for bringing good luck. One step below that was the average height dark-haired man, still desirable, still lucky. Then came dark-haired boys. Young men, teenagers, acceptable but not ideal because they had not yet proven themselves in life. And then, below all of them, the unlucky categories. Light-haired men were risky, blonde men were worse, red-haired men were absolutely forbidden, and women, any woman, regardless of hair colour, was considered catastrophically bad luck. But it gets even more detailed. The first footer could not be cross-eyed or flat-footed. In some parts of Scotland, if your eyebrows met in the middle, you were unlucky. Birthmark on your face? Unlucky. Walked with a limp? Unlucky. Missing teeth? Unlucky. The list went on. And here is the truly disturbing part. There are documented cases from the Victorian era of people being attacked on New Year's Eve simply for having the wrong appearance. In 1877 in Durham, a blonde man named Peter Jameson was walking home from work around 11:30 at night on December 31st. He was minding his own business, just trying to get home. But as he walked through the town square, a group of men surrounded him. Ordinary citizens, and they told him, "You cannot be out here. Not tonight. You need to go home and stay inside until after midnight." Peter, confused and frightened, tried to explain that he was just passing through. He had no intention of entering anyone's home. But the men would not listen. They escorted him forcibly to the edge of town, told him to take the long way around through the fields so he would not accidentally be seen near anyone's doorway when the clock struck 12. And they warned him that if he was spotted in the town centre at midnight, there would be consequences. A man being run out of town not for committing a crime, but for existing with the wrong hair colour at the wrong time. This was not ancient history. This was the Victorian era. The age of science, the age of industry, the age of supposed progress. And yet here we are, with mobs of people enforcing superstitions with threats of violence. Now, let me tell you about the gifts the first footer had to bring, because the reasons reveal so much about Victorian fears and values. Coal represented warmth, yes, but also power. Coal was the fuel of the Industrial Revolution. It kept factories running, trains moving, homes heated. To give someone coal was to give them the ability to survive. It was to give them agency in a world that often felt cold and unforgiving. Silver could not be just any coin, it had to be silver. Because silver had intrinsic value. Silver was real wealth. The act of handing over silver was an act of sacrifice. The first footer was giving up something valuable to bless your household. Whisky was specifically Scottish. It represented Hogmanay tradition, the Scottish New Year celebration that had influenced English custom so heavily. It was a nod to rituals older than Christianity, older than the Victorian Empire, older than anyone could remember. Salt had two meanings. It represented flavour, making life more enjoyable, but also preservation. Before refrigeration, salt kept meat from rotting, fish edible. To bring salt was to bring the promise that your family would not decay, would not fall apart. And bread, the staff of life, the most basic, essential food. In Christian tradition, bread was the body of Christ. In pagan tradition, bread was the harvest, the gift of the gods. To bring bread was to bring life itself. So when the first footer arrived carrying these 5 items, he was bringing a complete package of survival. Warmth, wealth, joy, preservation and sustenance. Everything a family needed to make it through another year. But not every family could afford to have the perfect first footer. Not every family had access to a tall, dark-haired male friend willing to brave the cold at midnight. So what did poor families do? What did isolated families do? They improvised, and sometimes their improvisations were tragic. There are records from rural Scotland of families who, unable to secure a proper first footer, would leave their doors open all night. They would sit inside shivering because you could not close the door once you opened it at midnight, not until the first footer arrived. And they would wait. sometimes until dawn, hoping that anyone who met the basic criteria, would pass by and agree to step inside. Imagine sitting in your home with the door wide open on a freezing January night, your children huddled around a dwindling fire because you were too poor or too isolated to arrange for a proper first footer. Imagine the desperation, the cold, the fear that maybe no one would come at all. There is a documented case from 1892 in the Scottish Highlands. A widow named Margaret Campbell lived alone with her 3 children in a cottage at the edge of a village. Her husband had died the previous year, and she had no male relatives nearby. As New Year's Eve approached, she became increasingly anxious. She could not leave her door closed at midnight, because that would trap the old year's misfortune inside. But she also had no one to serve as her first footer, so she did something desperate. She paid a local boy, a 10-year-old child with dark hair, to wait outside her cottage in the snow. She paid him a penny, which was significant for her, to stand in the freezing cold and knock on her door at 1 minute past midnight. The boy agreed, but when midnight came and went, the boy did not knock. Margaret waited. Finally, at nearly 1 in the morning, she opened the door to check on him. She found him huddled against the side of her cottage, shivering uncontrollably, too cold to move, too frightened to knock because he was worried he would get the timing wrong and bring bad luck instead of good. Margaret brought the boy inside, wrapped him in blankets, gave him hot tea, but the damage was done. In her mind she had failed. No proper first footer had crossed her threshold, and for the entire year of 1893, every hardship she faced, every illness, every financial struggle she attributed to that failure. The psychological weight of that belief likely made her year harder than it needed to be. This is the power of superstition. This is why first footing was not just a silly tradition, it was a psychological trap, a self-fulfilling prophecy that could destroy lives through the sheer force of belief. And yet, despite all the fear, despite all the anxiety, despite all the social hierarchy and discrimination and cruelty that first footing created, people kept doing it, generation after generation. Why? Because it gave them a sense of control. In a world where you could die from drinking bad water, where your crops could fail for reasons you did not understand, where your children could be taken by diseases that had no cure, having a ritual, having rules, having some sense that you could influence fate, that was everything. Even if the ritual did not actually work, even if hair colour had no bearing on luck, even if the whole thing was based on ancient fears that had no basis in reality, it did not matter. Because the ritual served a purpose, it gave people something to do, something to focus on, something to believe in. And can we really judge them for that? Here we are, over 100 years later, and we still knock on wood. We still throw salt over our shoulders. We still avoid walking under ladders. We still have lucky numbers and unlucky days. We have not eliminated superstition. We have just changed its form. The Victorians were not more irrational than we are. They were just more honest about their fears. They codified them. They turned them into traditions. They built entire social structures around them. And yes, those structures were often cruel. Yes, they hurt people. Yes, they created divisions based on arbitrary characteristics. But they also gave people hope. They gave people community. They gave people a shared experience, a collective ritual, a way of marking time and transition that felt meaningful. So the next time you see someone knock on wood or avoid the number 13 or refuse to open an umbrella indoors, remember the first footers, remember Thomas Wright sitting alone because his red hair made him a pariah. Remember Margaret Campbell, desperate for someone to bless her threshold. Remember all the people throughout history who have tried to control the uncontrollable through ritual and belief, because that is what we are all doing. We are all just trying to survive in an uncertain world. We are all just trying to protect the people we love. We are all just trying to make sense of the chaos, and sometimes that means caring very much about who walks through your door first on New Year's Day, even if deep down we know it probably does not matter at all. But the first footing tradition, as intense as it was, still had some internal logic to it. What comes next? That is where Victorian New Year's traditions went from superstitious to absolutely insane. Because we are about to talk about the gentleman callers, the marathon drinking sessions, the speed dating disaster that was Victorian New Year's Day. And if you think being judged by your hair colour is bad, wait until you hear about what happened when young men were expected to visit 50 homes in one day while getting progressively, catastrophically drunk at each stop. That story is coming up next. Alright, so you have made it through the threshold ritual. You've survived the first footer anxiety. You think the worst is over, right? You think Victorian New Year's celebrations can finally relax into something normal? Oh, my friend, we are just getting started. Because what happened on New Year's Day itself was perhaps the most exhausting, most absurd and most quietly devastating tradition of them all. And it involved young men, unmarried women, and enough alcohol to drown a small village. Welcome to the world of New Year's Day calling. Or as I like to think of it, Victorian speed dating meets an endurance sport meets a recipe for alcoholism. Here is how it worked. On January 1st, wealthy Victorian families with unmarried daughters would hold what they called open houses. From roughly noon until 6 in the evening, their doors would be unlocked. Food would be laid out, drinks would be prepared, and most importantly, the daughters would be dressed in their finest clothes, hair perfectly arranged, sitting in the parlour like merchandise on display, waiting, hoping, praying that the right kind of men would walk through that door. And the men, the eligible bachelors of the community, they were expected to make the rounds, visit as many houses as possible, spend 15 minutes here, 20 minutes there, chatting with the young ladies, sampling the refreshments, and then moving on to the next house, and the next, and the next. Now, if you are thinking, well, that sounds kind of nice, like a social gathering, let me give you some numbers that will change your mind. In New York City, where this tradition reached its most extreme form, there are documented accounts of men visiting over 50 houses in a single day. 50. That is 50 different homes, 50 different families, 50 different groups of young women to charm and impress. And at every single one of those houses, the man would be offered a drink, usually something strong, whisky, brandy, rum punch. Do the math with me here. 50 houses, 1 drink per house at minimum, that is 50 drinks in 6 hours. Even if each drink was small, even if the man only took a sip at each location, we are talking about a catastrophic amount of alcohol consumed in a very short period of time. And here is the kicker. This was not optional. This was not something you did if you felt like it. If you were an unmarried man of a certain social class, this was your duty, your obligation, your way of proving that you were a respectable member of society. If you did not participate, if you stayed home on New Year's Day, people would talk. They would wonder what was wrong with you. Were you antisocial? Were you hiding something? Were you not serious about finding a wife? So men would drag themselves out of bed after a late night of New Year's Eve celebrations, put on their best suits, arm themselves with stacks of calling cards, and begin what can only be described as a marathon of forced socializing and systematic intoxication. Let me tell you about Palmer Cox. He was an artist and writer who documented this tradition in a book published in 1874 called Squibs of California. And his description of New Year's Day calling is both hilarious and horrifying. He wrote, and I am paraphrasing here because his Victorian language is quite flowery, that young men would start the day fresh-faced, clean-shaven, full of energy and enthusiasm. They would arrive at the first few houses with perfect posture, witty conversation, and impeccable manners. But as the day wore on, as they moved from house to house, as the drinks accumulated in their systems, they would begin to deteriorate. By the 10th house, they were a little flushed. By the 20th house, their ties were crooked. By the 30th house, they were slurring their words. And by the 40th house, they were barely coherent, stumbling through doors, forgetting which house they were at, sometimes even forgetting the names of the young ladies they were supposed to be courting. Cox described seeing men on the streets in the late afternoon who were so drunk they could not remember where they lived. They would wander from block to block, confused, disoriented, occasionally falling into snowbanks, and yet they would keep going, because to stop, to give up, to go home before completing as many visits as possible, that would be shameful, that would be weak. Can you imagine being one of those men? Can you imagine the pressure, not just the physical pressure of consuming that much alcohol, but the social pressure of having to be charming and impressive at every single house, knowing that these families were evaluating you as a potential husband, knowing that one wrong word, one inappropriate joke, one moment of awkwardness could ruin your reputation? But wait, it gets worse, because I have not even told you about the women's perspective yet. Imagine you are a young woman in Victorian New York or London or Boston. You're unmarried. Your family is well off enough to participate in this tradition. And New Year's Day is coming. This is your chance, your one big opportunity every year to meet a large number of eligible men in a short period of time. This is essentially your annual job fair, except the job you are trying to get is wife. So you prepare. You spend days, maybe weeks, planning your outfit. Your mother helps you practice conversation topics. What will you say when a man enters? How will you appear interested but not desperate? Charming but not forward? Intelligent but not intimidating? You rehearse these interactions in your mind over and over, and then the day arrives. You sit in your parlour, the clock strikes noon, and you wait. Will anyone come? Will the right kind of men come? Will you be able to make a good impression in the 15 minutes you have with each visitor before he rushes off to the next house? The first man arrives, your heart races, you smile, you offer him tea or punch, you try to start a conversation, and just as you feel like maybe, just maybe, you are connecting with this person, he glances at his pocket watch, makes an excuse and leaves, off to the next house, off to the next young woman. The second man arrives, same routine, 15 minutes, then gone. The third man arrives, 15 minutes, gone, and you realize something crushing. You're not a person to these men. You're a checkbox on a list, a stop on a route, one face among dozens they will see today, and they will not remember you. They will not remember your name or your conversation or anything about you because their brains are swimming in alcohol and social obligation. There is a heartbreaking account from a young woman named Sarah Mitchell, written in her diary in January of 1889. She describes New Year's Day that year with such raw emotion. She writes, and again I am paraphrasing, that she sat in her parlour from noon until 6. 23 men visited her house. 23, and not a single one of them stayed longer than 12 minutes. Not a single one of them asked her a meaningful question. Not a single one of them seemed to see her as a real person. She writes that by the end of the day she felt like a painting on a wall, something to be glanced at, briefly appreciated, and then forgotten. She writes that she cried herself to sleep that night feeling utterly worthless, utterly invisible. And here is the thing that makes this even more tragic. Sarah was, by all accounts, a lovely person, educated, kind, talented. She played piano beautifully. She spoke French fluently, she volunteered at a local hospital, but none of that mattered on New Year's Day, because New Year's Day was not about getting to know someone. It was about quantity over quality. It was about men performing masculinity by visiting as many houses as possible, and women performing desirability by attracting as many visitors as possible. The whole system was designed to be shallow, to be superficial, to reduce human connection to a series of brief, meaningless encounters. And the competition among women was fierce. Families would keep count of how many callers they received. It was a status symbol, a measure of social worth. If you had 30 callers, you were popular. If you had 50, you were the belle of the season. If you had 10, you were practically a failure. And if you had fewer than 5, well, that was humiliating. That meant something was wrong with you or your family's reputation. Some families would even publish the number of callers they received in the local newspaper. Can you imagine that? Your social value, your marriageability, your worth as a human being reduced to a number printed in the paper for everyone to see and judge. And the young women had no control over any of it. They could not go out and visit other houses themselves. That would be scandalous, improper, unladylike. They had to sit and wait, passive, powerless, hoping that enough men would walk through their door to save them from social embarrassment. Now, you might be wondering, did this actually lead to marriages? Did any of these brief encounters result in genuine connections? And the answer is yes, sometimes. There are records of couples who met during New Year's Day calling and eventually married. But there are also records of disastrous mismatches. Men who proposed to women they barely knew after seeing them for 15 minutes on New Year's Day. Women who accepted proposals out of desperation, terrified that this might be their only chance. And then there are the darker stories. The men who used New Year's Day calling as an excuse to prey on vulnerable women, who would visit houses, get the young women alone for a few moments, make inappropriate advances, and then leave before anyone could stop them. The social chaos of the day, the constant stream of visitors, the alcohol-fueled atmosphere, it created opportunities for misconduct. There is a documented case from 1891 in New York where a man named Charles Whitmore visited a house on New Year's Day, cornered a young woman in a hallway, attempted to kiss her without consent, and when she pushed him away, he laughed it off as New Year's cheer and moved on to the next house. The young woman, whose name was not recorded in the reports, told her parents what happened, but her father decided not to pursue the matter because making it public would damage her reputation more than his. Think about that. A woman was assaulted in her own home during what was supposed to be a respectable social tradition, and she could not even seek justice because the shame would fall on her, not on her attacker. That is the reality of Victorian social customs. They looked beautiful on the surface. They had all these elaborate rules and rituals, but underneath they were often cruel, dangerous, and deeply unfair. By the late 1890s, the tradition of New Year's Day calling was starting to collapse under its own weight. Men were getting tired of the excessive drinking. Women were getting tired of the shallow interactions. Families were getting tired of the expense and stress of hosting open houses. And society was beginning to realize that maybe, just maybe, this was not a healthy way to help young people find partners. The tradition shifted. Instead of open houses where anyone could drop by, families started sending formal invitations. Instead of marathon visiting, men would attend 1 or 2 select gatherings. Instead of brief 15-minute encounters, parties would last several hours, giving people actual time to talk and get to know each other. By the 1920s, New Year's Day calling had almost completely disappeared, replaced by New Year's Eve parties that emphasized celebration over matchmaking and honestly good riddance. But here is what fascinates me about this tradition. It shows us something important about Victorian society. On the surface, Victorians appeared so proper, so controlled, so morally upright. But scratch that surface and you find chaos. You find young men getting blackout drunk as part of a respectable social ritual. You find young women being treated like commodities in a market. You find families desperately trying to maintain appearances while privately struggling with the absurdity of it all. The Victorians were masters of pretending, of creating elaborate social structures that looked impressive but functioned terribly. And New Year's Day calling was one of the best examples of that. It looked like a charming way to bring communities together. It looked like a wholesome tradition to help young people meet. But in reality, it was exhausting, degrading, and often harmful to everyone involved. So the next time someone tells you they wish we could go back to the good old days when courtship was more formal and romantic, remind them of New Year's Day calling. Remind them of the men stumbling drunk through the streets. Remind them of the women sitting in parlours feeling invisible and worthless. Remind them that the past was not better, it was just different, and often it was worse. And you know what? We are not even done with the bizarre traditions of Victorian New Year's yet. Because after the gentlemen callers finally stumbled home, after the young women finally stopped smiling and pretending, there was still one more ritual that had to be performed, one more superstition that had to be honoured, and this one involved fire, ashes, and the very real danger of burning your house down in the name of good luck. That is what we are diving into next. So stay with me. Because the ashes ritual, it is going to show you just how far Victorians were willing to go to feel like they had some control over their fate, even if it meant risking everything. There is something deeply ironic about Victorian New Year's traditions, and I mean truly darkly ironic. These people were obsessed with protection, with safety, with warding off evil and ensuring good fortune. And yet, one of their most sacred New Year's rituals involved doing something incredibly dangerous. Something that, in hindsight, seems absolutely insane. They would take hot ashes from their fires and sweep them out of their homes on New Year's Eve, while the fires were still burning, while the coals were still glowing. And they believed that if they did not do this, if they left even a speck of ash from the old year in their hearth, they would be cursed. Let me say that again, just so we are clear. Victorian families, in the middle of winter, would clean out their fireplaces on the coldest night of the year. They would handle hot ashes, they would carry them through their homes, and they would dispose of them outside, all in the name of symbolically sweeping away the problems of the past year. Now, before you think, well, maybe they waited for the fires to cool down, let me stop you right there. They could not wait. The ritual had to be performed on New Year's Eve itself. Specifically, it had to be completed before midnight. Because once the clock struck 12, once the new year arrived, it was too late. The old year's misfortune would be trapped inside your home, mixed with the new year's potential, creating a spiritual contamination that would ruin everything. So families had no choice. They had to sweep hot ashes, and yes, people got burned. Yes, houses caught fire. Yes, there are documented cases of this ritual going horribly, catastrophically wrong. Let me tell you about the Hendricks family. They lived in a small town in Lancashire, England in 1876. James Hendricks was the father, a factory worker, a practical man who did not particularly believe in superstitions but went along with them to keep his wife happy. His wife Eleanor was deeply religious but also deeply superstitious. She believed that the old rituals, the ones passed down from her grandmother, were just as important as the prayers she said in church every Sunday. On New Year's Eve, 1876, Eleanor insisted that the family perform the ashes ritual. James protested. He pointed out that their fire was still quite hot. They had been burning coal all day to keep the house warm, and the hearth was full of glowing embers. Maybe, he suggested, they could wait a few hours. Let the fire die down, clean it out safely after midnight. But Eleanor would not hear of it. She had seen her mother do this ritual every year of her childhood. She had done it herself every year of her marriage. And she was not about to stop now. So James reluctantly agreed. He took the iron shovel they used for the coal. He began scooping out the ashes, and at first everything seemed fine. The ashes were hot, yes, but manageable. He carried them in a metal bucket to the back door, dumped them in the snow outside and returned for the next load. But on his third trip, something went wrong. A gust of wind blew through the open door. It caught the ashes in the bucket, lifted them into the air and scattered them across the wooden floor of the kitchen. And these were not cool ashes, these were hot ashes, still glowing, still capable of igniting. Within seconds, the wooden floor started to smoke. Eleanor screamed. James dropped the bucket and ran for water. But in a Victorian home, you did not have running water. You had a pump, or a well, or buckets that you had filled earlier in the day. James grabbed the nearest bucket of water and threw it on the smoking floor. It helped, but not enough. The fire was spreading. Small flames were licking up the edges of the floorboards. The children, 3 of them, ages 5, 8 and 11, were rushed outside by their mother. Neighbours heard the commotion and came running with more water. Together they managed to put out the fire before it consumed the entire house, but the kitchen was destroyed. The floor was burned through in places, the walls were blackened with smoke, and the family's savings, what little they had, would have to go toward repairs. All because of a superstition. All because Eleanor believed that leaving ashes in the hearth would bring bad luck. The irony is almost painful, is it not? She was trying to prevent misfortune, and in doing so she created a disaster that nearly killed her family. But here is the thing that makes this story even more tragic. Eleanor did not learn from this experience. In her mind, the fire was not caused by the ritual. The fire was caused by not performing the ritual correctly. She must have made a mistake. She must have done something wrong. And so the next year, on New Year's Eve 1877, she insisted they do it again. This time James refused. They had their first major argument as a couple. And eventually Eleanor performed the ritual herself while James was out of the house, sweeping the ashes quickly and carefully, terrified the entire time that she would set another fire, but more terrified of what would happen if she did not do it at all. This is the psychological trap of superstition. When something goes wrong, you do not blame the superstition. You blame yourself for not following it perfectly, and so you double down. You become even more committed to the ritual, even more anxious about getting it right. Now you might be thinking, surely not everyone took this ritual so seriously. Surely some people were smart enough to wait for the fire to cool down or to skip it entirely. And you would be right. There were people who thought the ashes ritual was ridiculous. There were people who refused to participate. But those people were judged harshly. There is a fascinating account from a woman named Beatrice Thornton, written in her diary in January of 1884. Beatrice was educated, wealthy, well-travelled. She had spent time in London and Paris. She considered herself a modern woman, a rational woman, someone who did not believe in old superstitions. So when New Year's Eve came around and a housekeeper suggested they perform the ashes ritual, Beatrice said no. Absolutely not. It was dangerous, it was unnecessary, and it was beneath her dignity as an educated person. The housekeeper was horrified. She begged Beatrice to reconsider. She warned her that terrible things would happen if the ritual was not performed. But Beatrice stood firm. No ashes would be swept in her house. And then, over the course of the next year, a series of unfortunate events occurred. In March, Beatrice's favourite horse went lame. In June, her cousin died unexpectedly of pneumonia. In September, a valuable piece of jewellery went missing, likely stolen by a servant. And in November, Beatrice herself fell ill with a severe respiratory infection that kept her bedridden for 3 weeks. Now, were any of these events actually caused by not sweeping ashes on New Year's Eve? Of course not. These were normal misfortunes, random events. The kind of things that happened to people all the time in the Victorian era when medical care was limited and life was generally unpredictable. But Beatrice's servants did not see it that way. They whispered among themselves. They said that Beatrice had brought this all on herself. She had refused to honour the old traditions. She had rejected the wisdom of her ancestors, and now she was paying the price. Even Beatrice herself, in her diary entries from November, begins to wonder. She writes, and I am paraphrasing, that she still does not truly believe in the ashes ritual. She still thinks it is superstitious nonsense, but she also admits that a small part of her, a part she is almost ashamed to acknowledge, wonders if maybe, just maybe, there was something to it after all. She writes that she plans to sweep the ashes the following New Year's Eve, just in case, just to be safe. This is how superstitions survive. They survive because humans are pattern-seeking creatures. We look for connections between events even when no connection exists. And once we start to believe even a little bit, it becomes almost impossible to stop. But let us talk about what the ashes ritual actually represented. Because like most Victorian traditions, it was not just random, it had meaning, it had symbolism, it was rooted in ideas that made sense within a certain worldview. In Victorian Britain, the hearth was the heart of the home. It was where families gathered, where food was cooked, where warmth came from during the brutal winter months. The fire in your hearth was not just practical, it was symbolic. It represented life, vitality, continuity. As long as your fire burned, your family survived. But the hearth also accumulated residue, ashes, soot, the burned remains of what had been consumed to keep you alive. And Victorians believed that these ashes were not just physical waste, they were spiritual waste. They contained the accumulated sorrows, illnesses, and misfortunes of the past year. Every argument, every loss, every moment of despair, all of it was burned into those ashes. So the act of sweeping out the ashes was an act of spiritual cleansing. You were literally removing the physical manifestation of your suffering. You were making space in your home for new energy, new possibility, new hope. And by doing it on New Year's Eve, you were ensuring that the boundary between the old year and the new year was clean, that nothing bad from the past would carry forward into the future. It is actually quite a beautiful idea when you think about it. The problem, of course, is the execution, the danger, the fire risk, the burns, the destroyed homes, the fact that Victorians were so committed to the symbolism that they were willing to endanger themselves and their families to make it happen. And here is something else that is fascinating. The ashes ritual was not just a private family affair. In some communities it became a public spectacle. There are accounts from Scotland and northern England of entire villages gathering on New Year's Eve to watch the ashes being carried out of homes. Young men would volunteer to be the ones to do it, proving their bravery by handling the hottest ashes, by carrying the heaviest buckets, by making the most dramatic displays of sweeping away the old year. It became a competition. Who could sweep their ashes the fastest? Who could handle the most heat without flinching? Who could make the biggest show of rejecting the past and embracing the future? And of course, with competition comes stupidity. There are documented cases of young men burning themselves severely because they were trying to impress their neighbours, trying to prove their masculinity through pain. One account from 1889 describes a man named Robert MacLeod in a village outside Edinburgh. Robert was known as the strongest man in the village, a blacksmith, huge muscles, hands like iron. And on New Year's Eve, he boasted that he could carry out an entire bucket of hot ashes without using gloves or a towel, just his bare hands. His friends dared him to do it. A small crowd gathered to watch, and Robert, drunk on whisky and pride, picked up a bucket of glowing hot ashes and carried it from the hearth to the door. He made it about 15 feet before the pain became unbearable. He dropped the bucket, the ashes spilled, his hands were covered in blisters, and he spent the first 3 months of the new year unable to work, unable to use his hands properly, all because he wanted to prove how tough he was. The village doctor who treated him wrote about the incident in his journal. He called it, quote, a senseless display of masculine bravado disguised as tradition. He noted that he saw several similar cases every new year, young men burning themselves in various ways, and he wished that people would abandon these dangerous customs in favour of safer celebrations. But they did not abandon them, not for decades, because the power of tradition is stronger than the power of reason, because the fear of breaking with the past is stronger than the fear of getting hurt, because humans would rather risk physical harm than social shame. And honestly, we're not that different today, are we? Think about all the dangerous things people do on New Year's Eve in the 21st century. Drunk driving, setting off fireworks without proper precautions, climbing on roofs to watch fireworks, staying out in freezing weather without proper clothing. We still do risky things in the name of celebration. We have just changed the specific rituals. The Victorian ashes tradition eventually faded away, not because people suddenly became rational, but because the nature of heating changed. As central heating became more common in the early 20th century, as coal fires were replaced by gas and electric heat, the hearth lost its symbolic power. There were no more ashes to sweep, no more physical manifestation of the year's suffering to remove. The ritual simply became obsolete. But the impulse behind it, the desire to mark a transition, to cleanse yourself of the past, to start fresh, that impulse never went away. We still deep clean our homes before New Year. We still talk about new beginnings and fresh starts. We still perform rituals, even if they are different rituals, to try to control the uncontrollable. So when you are vacuuming your living room this New Year's Eve, when you are wiping down surfaces and organizing clutter, remember the Victorians sweeping their hot ashes. Remember Eleanor Hendricks nearly burning down her kitchen. Remember Beatrice Thornton's crisis of doubt. Remember Robert MacLeod's blistered hands. And maybe, just maybe, feel grateful that your New Year's cleaning ritual does not involve risking third-degree burns. But you know what is truly wild? The ashes ritual was dangerous, yes. It was risky and painful and led to actual disasters. But it was still relatively tame compared to what comes next. Because we are about to talk about a Victorian New Year's tradition that involved kidnapping, physical punishment, mob violence, and all of it was considered not just acceptable but fun, a bit of harmless New Year's entertainment. So if you thought sweeping hot ashes was crazy, just wait. The story of riding the stang is going to make you question everything you thought you knew about Victorian morality, and it is coming up next. If you have been listening closely up to this point, you might have noticed a pattern in Victorian New Year's traditions. They all involve some form of fear of the wrong person entering your home, fear of not performing rituals correctly, fear of cursing your entire year through a single mistake. But what I am about to tell you now goes beyond fear. It crosses into something much darker, something that reveals just how thin the line was between celebration and violence in Victorian society. Riding the stang, even the name sounds ominous, does it not? Like something from a medieval torture chamber, and in many ways that's exactly what it was. A punishment that survived from the Middle Ages, transformed over centuries and somehow ended up being considered acceptable New Year's entertainment by the Victorians. Let me explain what this actually involved, and I promise you by the end of this section, you will understand why I said the ashes ritual was tame by comparison. Riding the stang was a form of public humiliation. It worked like this. On New Year's Day, a group of men, sometimes a dozen, sometimes more, would gather together. They would select a target, someone in the community who had, in their judgment, violated social norms, and then they would abduct that person. Yes, abduct. They would forcibly take them from their home or from the street. They would make that person straddle a long wooden pole called a stang. 2 or more men would hoist the pole onto their shoulders with the victim sitting on top, and then they would parade through the town carrying the victim to the nearest pub, banging on pots and pans, shouting rhymes and insults, making as much noise as possible to draw attention. The victim would be displayed like this, humiliated in front of their entire community, until they either paid a fine to the crowd or were deemed to have suffered enough. Only then would they be released. Now, in the medieval period, riding the stang was used to punish actual criminals. Thieves, adulterers, people who had committed genuine offences against the community. But by the Victorian era, the ritual had evolved, or devolved, depending on how you look at it. It was no longer about serious crimes, it became about social transgressions, and on New Year's Day specifically, it became about something even more disturbing. It became a way to punish men who were perceived as weak. Let me be very specific about this. The primary targets for New Year's Day stang riding were men who had been beaten by their wives, or men who allowed their wives to dominate them, or men who, in the eyes of their neighbours, had failed to maintain proper masculine authority in their households. This was called being henpecked, and in Victorian Britain, being henpecked was considered shameful enough to warrant public torture. Think about what this means. A man could be physically abused by his wife. He could be the victim of domestic violence, and instead of receiving sympathy or support, he would be kidnapped on New Year's Day, forced to ride a pole through town and mocked by his entire community. The message was clear. If you are a man who cannot control your wife, you deserve to be punished. You deserve to be humiliated. You deserve to suffer. There is a documented case from 1881 in the village of Ashton in Yorkshire. A man named William Parker lived with his wife Martha and their 2 children in a small cottage. By all accounts, Martha was a difficult woman. She had a terrible temper. She would throw things during arguments. She once hit William with a frying pan hard enough to leave a scar. The neighbours knew about this. They heard the fights, they saw the bruises. On New Year's Day, 1881, a group of about 15 men showed up at William's door. They were not angry, they were not violent, they were almost cheerful. They told William it was time for him to ride the stang. William protested. He tried to explain that he had done nothing wrong, but the men would not listen. They grabbed him, they forced him onto a wooden pole, and they carried him through the village while others followed, banging on pots and pans, singing a mocking rhyme. The rhyme went something like this, and I am translating from the Yorkshire dialect here. It is neither for your sake nor my sake that I ride the stang, but it is for William Parker who lets his wife beat him with a frying pan, and if we hear that she does it again, we will come back with fife and drum and ride the stang again. William was mortified, utterly destroyed by this experience. But here is the truly horrifying part. Martha, his abusive wife, was not punished at all. She was not kidnapped. She was not humiliated. She was allowed to stand in the doorway of their cottage and watch as her husband was paraded through town like a criminal. And after William was finally released, after he paid the crowd a few coins to make them stop, he went home to the same situation. Nothing had changed, except now everyone in the village knew that he was weak. Everyone knew that he could not control his wife, and his shame was complete. Can you imagine the psychological damage this caused? Can you imagine being victimized twice, once by your abuser and once by your community for not being man enough to stop the abuse? This was not justice, this was not protection, this was cruelty masquerading as tradition, and it was not just about domestic violence. There are records of men being forced to ride the stang for other perceived failures of masculinity. A man who cried too much after his mother died. A man who let his wife make financial decisions. A man who was too gentle with his children. Any deviation from rigid masculine norms could make you a target. And New Year's Day, for reasons I cannot fully explain, became the designated time for this ritual. Perhaps because it was a moment of transition, a time when communities reasserted their values and punished those who had strayed from them over the previous year. But here is where it gets even more complicated. Because while most victims of stang riding were men accused of being henpecked, the ritual was also used against women, specifically women who were too assertive, too independent, too willing to challenge male authority. These women were labelled as scolds, and riding the stang for a woman often involved even worse humiliation. In some regions, a woman forced to ride the stang would first have her face painted with flour or soot. She would be dressed in ridiculous clothing. Sometimes they would put a dunce cap on her head, or make her carry household items like brooms and cooking pots to emphasize her role as a woman. And then she would be paraded through town while the crowd chanted insults about her character, her appearance, her behaviour. There is an account from 1874 in Doncaster of a woman named Eliza Thompson who was forced to ride the stang on New Year's Day. Her crime? She had argued too loudly with her husband in public. She had, according to witnesses, raised her voice and used profanity. This was considered unacceptable behaviour for a Victorian woman. So a mob formed. They grabbed Eliza, they forced her onto the stang, and they carried her through the streets while people threw rotten vegetables at her and called her vile names. Eliza's husband, who'd been the one arguing with her in the first place, did nothing to stop this. In fact, according to some accounts, he joined in the mockery, because to defend his wife would have been to admit that she had a right to argue with him, and that admission would have made him look weak. After the ordeal was over, Eliza went home. She never spoke publicly about what happened to her, but her daughter, years later, wrote in a letter that her mother was never the same after that New Year's Day. She became quiet, submissive, afraid to express opinions. The public humiliation had broken something in her spirit. This is what riding the stang really was. It was not fun, it was not entertainment, it was community-sanctioned abuse. It was a way for the majority to enforce conformity through violence and humiliation. And the fact that it happened on New Year's Day, a day supposed to be about fresh starts and new beginnings, makes it all the more grotesque. Now, you might be wondering, how did this happen? How did a medieval punishment for criminals become a New Year's tradition for punishing people who did not fit social norms? The answer lies in something historians call rough music or charivari. These were old European customs where communities would gather to make loud, discordant noise outside the homes of people they disapproved of. It was a form of social control, a way to shame people into conforming without involving legal authorities. Over time, rough music evolved. It became more elaborate, more ritualized, and in some regions of England it merged with the tradition of stang riding. The physical punishment of being carried on a pole combined with the auditory punishment of being surrounded by mocking noise. And because New Year's was already a time of ritual and tradition, a time when communities came together to mark transitions, it became a natural occasion for this kind of mob justice. But here is something that I find particularly disturbing. The people who participated in stang riding did not see themselves as cruel. They did not think they were doing something wrong. They genuinely believed they were upholding community values. They believed they were teaching important lessons. They believed that public humiliation was a legitimate tool for maintaining social order. There are newspaper accounts from the 1880s where journalists describe stang riding as, quote, a bit of harmless New Year's fun. They describe the crowds as, quote, jovial and spirited. They describe the victims as, quote, good sports who took their punishment in stride. But if you read between the lines, if you look at the actual details of what happened, you see something very different. You see people who were terrified, who felt powerless, who carried the trauma of that experience for years. There is a particularly chilling account from 1886 in a town called Barnsley. A local newspaper published a light-hearted article about the New Year's Day stang riding, describing it as, quote, an amusing spectacle that drew quite a crowd. But buried in the article is a detail that the journalist clearly did not think was important. The victim, a man whose name was not given, fainted during the ordeal. He lost consciousness while being carried on the pole, possibly from fear, possibly from the physical strain, possibly from the sheer humiliation of it all. And the crowd laughed. They thought it was funny that he had fainted. They made jokes about his weakness. How is that entertainment? How is that acceptable? And yet it was, for decades, for generations, until slowly, gradually, public opinion began to shift. The decline of stang riding in the late Victorian period happened for several reasons. First, there was increasing awareness of the psychological harm caused by public humiliation. Doctors and social reformers began writing about the effects of shame and trauma. Second, legal authorities started to crack down on mob violence, even when it was dressed up as tradition. There are records of people being arrested and fined for participating in stang riding. And third, changing attitudes about gender and domestic violence meant that the underlying justifications for the ritual started to seem less acceptable. By the early 1900s, stang riding had mostly disappeared. It lingered in a few rural areas, but even there it became controversial. And by the 1920s it was gone, a relic of a brutal past that people preferred to forget. But here is what we need to remember. The people who participated in stang riding were not monsters. They were ordinary Victorians, farmers, shopkeepers, labourers, people who went to church on Sundays and believed in God and morality. They did not think they were being cruel. They thought they were upholding tradition. They thought they were maintaining social order. They thought they were doing the right thing. And that is the truly frightening part, because it means that cruelty does not require evil intentions. It does not require malice. It just requires a community that has convinced itself that certain forms of violence are justified, that certain people deserve to be punished, that tradition and social control are more important than individual dignity. We like to think we are so much better than the Victorians. We like to think we would never participate in something like stang riding. But look around. Look at how we treat people on social media. Look at cancel culture. Look at public shaming campaigns. Look at how quickly a mob can form online to destroy someone's reputation, someone's livelihood, someone's mental health, all in the name of justice or accountability or community standards. The tools have changed, the medium has changed, but the impulse to punish people publicly, to humiliate them in front of their community, to make an example of them as a warning to others, that impulse has not gone anywhere. We have just digitized it. So when you think about riding the stang, do not just think of it as a weird Victorian tradition. Think of it as a warning, a reminder of what happens when communities decide that public humiliation is an acceptable form of social control, a reminder of how easy it is to justify cruelty when you believe you're on the side of righteousness. And speaking of righteousness, we need to talk about another Victorian New Year's tradition that was wrapped in the language of morality but was actually something much stranger. Because after the stang riding was done, after the victims had been humiliated and released, Victorians would engage in a form of fortune-telling that they claimed was blessed by God himself. They would open their Bibles at random and point to verses that would supposedly predict their future for the coming year. And let me tell you, when your fate is determined by randomly pointing at ancient texts, things can go very, very wrong. That story is coming up next, and it is going to show you just how desperate the Victorians were for any sense of control over their lives, even if it meant misinterpreting sacred texts in the most absurd ways possible. Here is something that will surprise you. The Victorians, for all their Christian piety, for all their church attendance and moral posturing, had no problem turning the Bible into a fortune-telling device, a mystical object, tool for predicting the future. And they did this on New Year's Day every single year, in thousands of homes across Britain and America, with the full knowledge and participation of supposedly devout families. This practice was called dipping, or sometimes bibliomancy, and it worked like this. You would close your eyes, you would open the Bible to a random page, you would point your finger at a random spot on that page, and whatever verse your finger landed on, that verse would tell you what your year would be like, your fortune, your fate, your destiny for the next 365 days. Now, before you think, well, that sounds harmless enough, let me tell you what happened when people actually did this. Let me tell you about the psychological devastation it caused, the terror, the despair, because the Bible, if you've ever read it, contains a lot of really dark material. Plagues, wars, betrayals, deaths, suffering of every imaginable kind. And if your finger happened to land on one of those passages on New Year's Day, you were condemned to live in fear for an entire year. Let me tell you about Catherine Morrison. She lived in Edinburgh, Scotland in 1881. Catherine was 23 years old, recently married, expecting her first child. By all accounts, she should have been the happiest woman in the world. Her husband adored her. Her family supported her. She had everything to look forward to. On New Year's Day, 1881, Catherine's mother-in-law insisted that the family perform the dipping ritual. It was tradition, she said, something they did every year. Catherine, eager to fit into her new family, agreed. She had never done this before. Her own family was not particularly religious, but she wanted to be a good daughter-in-law. She wanted to honour the customs of her husband's family. So she closed her eyes, she opened the Bible, and she pointed. When she opened her eyes and looked down, her finger was resting on a verse from the book of Job, chapter 3, verse 11. And Job said, "Why did I not die at birth? Why did I not perish as I came from the womb?" Catherine went pale. Her hand started shaking because she was pregnant. And this verse, this prophecy, seemed to be telling her that her baby would die, that she herself might die in childbirth, that the joy she was anticipating would turn into tragedy. Her mother-in-law tried to reassure her. She said it was just a coincidence, just a random verse. It did not mean anything. But Catherine could not shake the feeling, the dread, the certainty that something terrible was going to happen. For the next 8 months, Catherine lived in a state of constant anxiety. She could not sleep, she could not eat properly. Every twinge of pain, every moment of discomfort she interpreted as a sign that the prophecy was coming true. Her husband begged her to forget about it, to focus on the present. But she could not. The verse haunted her. It consumed her thoughts. In September of 1881, Catherine gave birth to a healthy baby girl. The delivery was difficult, but not unusually so. Both mother and child survived. By all objective measures, the prophecy had been wrong. The Bible verse had been meaningless, just random words on a random page. But Catherine never fully recovered from the psychological trauma of those 8 months. She developed what we would now recognize as postpartum depression, though the Victorians did not have a name for it. She struggled to bond with her daughter. She became withdrawn, anxious, convinced that even though the immediate danger had passed, something else terrible was waiting just around the corner. Because the verse had said it. The Bible had predicted it, and surely the Bible could not be wrong. This is the danger of fortune-telling. Not that it accurately predicts the future, but that it creates self-fulfilling prophecies. Catherine's anxiety during her pregnancy could have actually harmed her health and her baby's health. Her depression after the birth definitely harmed her quality of life and her relationship with her child. The prophecy did not come true in the way she feared, but it still caused real damage, real suffering. Now you might be thinking, surely Catherine was an extreme case. Surely most people did not take the dipping ritual so seriously. And you would be partly right. There were people who treated it as a game, a bit of fun. They would laugh if they got a scary verse. They would make jokes about it. But there were also many, many people like Catherine, people who believed deeply, people for whom this was not a game but a genuine glimpse into their fate. And here is what makes this practice even more problematic. The Bible contains 666,000 words, give or take. That is a lot of words, and a significant portion of them are negative. Warnings, punishments, descriptions of suffering. So the odds of landing on something frightening were actually quite high. It was almost a guarantee that some members of your family would get scary verses, and then you had to watch them carry that burden for an entire year. There is an account from a minister in Wales written in his diary in January of 1876. He describes attending a New Year's gathering where several families perform the dipping ritual together. He writes that out of 12 people who participated, 9 of them landed on verses that could be interpreted as negative or ominous. One woman got a verse about pestilence, one man got a verse about losing his livelihood. A teenage girl got a verse about being abandoned by her loved ones. The minister writes that the atmosphere in the room changed completely after the ritual. What had been a joyful celebration became somber, worried. People started looking at each other with concern, wondering who would be the one to actually experience the predicted misfortune. And the minister himself, despite being a man of faith, felt deeply uncomfortable with what had just happened. He writes that he wished they had never performed the ritual, that sometimes he thought it was better not to know the future, or not to believe you knew it. But here is the fascinating contradiction at the heart of this practice. The Victorians were supposedly rational people. They were living in the age of science. Darwin had published his theories. Medicine was advancing, industry was booming, they had trains, telegraphs, photographs. They had evidence all around them that the world operated according to natural laws, not mystical forces. And yet they still believed that randomly pointing at a Bible verse could tell them their future. They still believed that God, or fate, or the universe, would guide their finger to the right spot. That there was meaning in the randomness. That nothing was truly random at all. This is the human need for meaning, for pattern, for the sense that there is some grand design, some purpose, some way to make sense of the chaos. And when official religion could not provide that sense of control, people turned to unofficial religious practices. They turned the Bible into a Ouija board. They turned prayer into spellcasting. They found ways to believe that they could influence or at least predict what was coming. Let me tell you about another case, a young man named Edward Fitzgerald in London, 1885. Edward was a clerk, hard-working, ambitious. He had dreams of moving up in his company, making something of himself. On New Year's Day, his landlady, a superstitious woman, insisted that everyone in the boarding house participate in the dipping ritual. Edward was sceptical. He did not believe in fortune-telling. He thought it was all nonsense, but he went along with it to be polite. He opened the Bible, pointed, and his finger landed on a verse from Ecclesiastes, chapter 9, verse 11. The race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, neither yet bread to the wise, nor yet riches to men of understanding, but time and chance happen to them all. At first, Edward laughed. He thought it was a meaningless verse, just philosophy, nothing specific, nothing frightening. But his landlady interpreted it differently. She said it meant that no matter how hard Edward worked, no matter how talented he was, he would not succeed. That success was just a matter of luck, and his luck, apparently, was bad. Edward brushed it off, went to work the next day, kept pursuing his goals. But over the course of the year, things started going wrong. Not in dramatic ways, not in ways that could be clearly linked to any curse or prophecy, just normal setbacks. A promotion went to someone else. A project he was working on got cancelled. He had a disagreement with his supervisor. Small things, things that happen to everyone. But Edward started to see them through the lens of that verse. He started to believe that maybe his landlady was right, that maybe he was doomed to fail no matter what he did. And that belief affected his behaviour. He became less confident, less assertive. He stopped taking risks, stopped putting himself forward for opportunities. Because why bother? The Bible had already told him he would not succeed. By the end of the year, Edward had not advanced in his career at all. Not because of any external barrier, not because of any lack of ability, but because he had internalized the prophecy. He had fulfilled it by believing in it. This is called a self-fulfilling prophecy, and it is one of the most powerful psychological mechanisms that exists. If you believe something will happen, you unconsciously behave in ways that make it more likely to happen. You create the very outcome you fear. The dipping ritual was a machine for creating self-fulfilling prophecies. It took people who were already anxious about the future, who were already uncertain about what was coming, and it gave their fears a specific form, a specific text, a specific prediction to worry about. And then those people spent the next year proving the prediction right. Now, let me be fair here. Not everyone who participated in dipping had negative experiences. There were people who got positive verses about blessings and prosperity and joy. And those people probably did have better years, not because the Bible predicted it, but because they went into the year with optimism, with confidence, with the belief that good things were coming, and that belief shaped their behavior in positive ways. This is the double-edged sword of fortune-telling. It can be a tool for empowerment if you get a positive prediction, but it can be a tool for destruction if you get a negative one. And with the Bible, where negative content is so common, the odds were stacked against you. There is also something deeply ironic about using the Bible this way. Because if you actually read Christian theology, if you study what the Bible itself says about divination and fortune-telling, it is explicitly forbidden. The Old Testament has multiple passages condemning divination, calling it an abomination, warning that people who practice it will be cut off from God. And yet, Victorian Christians somehow convinced themselves that using the Bible to tell fortunes was different, that it was acceptable because they were using a holy book, that God would guide them to the right verse, that this was not divination but divine communication. This is what we call cognitive dissonance. Holding two contradictory beliefs at the same time, believing that fortune-telling is sinful, while also believing that pointing at a random Bible verse will tell you your future. The human mind is incredibly good at rationalizing these contradictions, at finding ways to believe what we want to believe, even when it makes no logical sense. By the early 20th century, the dipping ritual started to fade away, not because people suddenly realized it was irrational, but because society as a whole was moving away from these kinds of home-based religious practices. Church attendance was declining, biblical literacy was declining, and new forms of fortune-telling like astrology and tarot cards were becoming popular. The specific ritual changed, but the impulse behind it, the need to know the future, that never went away. And honestly, we still do versions of this today, do we not? We read horoscopes, we check our daily affirmations, we look for signs and patterns in random events. We convince ourselves that the universe is sending us messages. The method has changed, but the underlying psychology is exactly the same. The Victorians were not more superstitious than we are. They were not more irrational. They just expressed their need for meaning and control in different ways. They used the Bible where we use apps. They gathered in parlours where we scroll on our phones. But the fundamental human desire to feel like we have some insight into what is coming, to feel like we are not completely at the mercy of chaos, that desire is timeless. So the next time you read your horoscope or pull a tarot card or check your fortune cookie, remember Catherine Morrison. Remember Edward Fitzgerald. Remember all the Victorians who pointed at Bible verses and then spent the next year living under the shadow of those words. And ask yourself, am I empowering myself with this information? Or am I creating a cage for myself? Am I gaining insight? Or am I just giving my anxiety a shape and a name? Because that is the real question with any form of fortune-telling. Not whether it is real or fake, true or false, but whether it helps you live better or whether it makes you live smaller, whether it opens up possibilities or closes them down, whether it gives you hope or whether it gives you fear. And with the Victorian dipping ritual, the answer was clear. For every person who found comfort in a positive verse, there were many more who found terror in a negative one. For every Edward who simply lost his confidence, there was a Catherine who spent 8 months in psychological torment. The cost was too high, the damage was too real. But you know what? The dipping ritual was not even the strangest fortune-telling method Victorians used on New Year's. Not even close. Because we're about to explore some truly bizarre practices that make pointing at a Bible seem almost reasonable. We are going to talk about reading tea leaves, about interpreting dreams, about using everyday objects to glimpse the future in ways that defy all logic. And some of these methods were not just strange, they were dangerous. They led people to make terrible decisions based on the most absurd superstitions imaginable. That is what we are diving into next, so stay with me. Because the Victorian obsession with knowing the future is about to get even weirder. You know what is truly heartbreaking about superstitions? They prey on our deepest fears, and for the Victorians, one fear stood above almost all others: the fear of poverty, the fear of not having enough, the fear of falling from whatever rung of the social ladder you occupied and tumbling down into destitution. And there was one New Year's superstition that took that fear and turned it into an annual ritual of financial paranoia. A tradition that forced poor families to do something that made no logical sense whatsoever. On New Year's Day, you had to have money in your pocket, real money, coins, preferably silver. It did not matter if you were broke. It did not matter if you owed rent. It did not matter if your children needed food. You had to have money in your pocket on January 1st, because if you did not, you would be poor for the entire year. The superstition guaranteed it. Now, think about what this meant for a family that was already struggling financially. They were faced with an impossible choice. Use their last bit of money for necessities, for survival, and risk a year of poverty according to the superstition. Or keep the money in their pocket, unused, as a magical charm, and still risk poverty because they were not spending money on things they actually needed. It was a trap, a psychological trap that turned poverty into a self-fulfilling prophecy, and it destroyed people. Let me tell you about the Whitmore family. They lived in Manchester, England in 1879. Thomas Whitmore worked in a textile mill. His wife Mary took in laundry to earn extra money. They had 4 children, and they were barely making ends meet. Every week was a struggle. Every month required careful planning. They were one accident, one illness, one job loss away from homelessness. December of 1878 was particularly harsh. Thomas had his hours cut at the mill. There was less work, less pay. Mary was sick for 2 weeks and could not take in as much laundry as usual. By the time New Year's Eve arrived, the family had almost nothing. A few coins, enough for maybe 3 or 4 days of bread and cheap vegetables. That was it. But Mary's mother, who lived with them, was deeply superstitious. She insisted that every member of the family had to have at least 1 coin in their pocket on New Year's Day. It was the rule. It was how you ensured financial security for the year ahead. If anyone in the family started the year with empty pockets, the whole family would suffer. Thomas and Mary knew this was nonsense. They knew that having a coin in their pocket would not magically make more money appear. But they also knew that defying the superstition would upset Mary's mother. And they needed her help with the children. They needed her emotional support. They could not afford to alienate her. So they made a decision that in retrospect seems insane. They took their small amount of money and divided it among all 7 people in the household. Every person got 1 coin, and those coins stayed in their pockets, unused, for the entire day of January 1st, while the family went hungry, while they had no money to buy food, while they could have used that money for something, anything, practical. By January 2nd, they were allowed to spend the coins, but by then the damage was done. They had skipped meals, the children had cried from hunger, and the psychological impact of prioritizing a superstition over their children's immediate needs created a rift in the family. Thomas felt like a failure as a father. Mary felt trapped between her mother and her children, and the children learned that magical thinking was more important than their own physical comfort. Now, you might think this was an isolated case, that most families were not this extreme, But you would be wrong, because there are dozens of documented accounts from the Victorian era of families borrowing money just to have coins in their pockets on New Year's Day. People would go to neighbours, to relatives, to anyone who would lend them a few coins, and they would promise to pay it back with interest, just so they could perform the ritual. There is an account from a social worker in London named Margaret Llewellyn Davies. She worked with poor families in the East End in the 1880s and 1890s, and she wrote extensively about the financial superstitions she observed. She describes one woman who borrowed money from 3 different neighbours to ensure that her entire family had coins on New Year's Day. The woman went into debt, actual debt, to satisfy a superstition. And when Margaret asked her why, when she explained that the superstition was not real, that having coins in your pocket could not possibly change your financial situation, the woman looked at her with genuine fear in her eyes. She said, and I am paraphrasing from Margaret's account, "I cannot take that chance. What if it is true? What if I doom my family to another year of poverty because I did not believe? I have to do it. I have no choice." This is the psychology of desperation. When you are already poor, when you are already struggling, you cannot afford to take any risks. You cannot afford to defy tradition, because what if it works? What if the one year you do not perform the ritual is the year everything falls apart? You will never forgive yourself. You will always wonder if you could have prevented it. So poor families, the people who could least afford to participate in this superstition, were the ones who felt most compelled to do it. While wealthy families could easily have money in their pockets, could perform the ritual without any sacrifice, poor families had to make real choices, real sacrifices, and those sacrifices often made their poverty worse, not better. There is a cruel irony in this. The superstition was supposed to prevent poverty, but in practice it often created or perpetuated poverty. Families would borrow money, go into debt, forgo necessary purchases, all to keep coins in their pockets. And then they would spend the rest of the year struggling to recover from those decisions. Let me tell you about another case, a young man named Henry Crawford in Birmingham, 1883. Henry was a labourer, strong, hard-working, but uneducated. He earned enough to live on, barely, if he was careful. He had no family, no support system, just himself and his wages. On New Year's Eve, 1882, Henry was in a pub. He had spent his last few coins on drinks, celebrating the holiday. At some point in the evening, someone mentioned the money pocket superstition. You need to have money when you wake up on New Year's Day, or you will be broke all year. Henry, drunk and suddenly panicked, realized he had nothing left. He had spent everything, so he did something desperate. He went to a pawn shop that was still open, one of the few that operated late on New Year's Eve to take advantage of people like Henry, and he pawned his coat, his only coat, in the middle of winter. He got a few shillings for it, enough to satisfy the superstition. January 1st, Henry woke up with coins in his pocket. He also woke up freezing cold because he had no coat, and it was winter in Birmingham, which meant cold, wet, miserable weather for the next several months. Henry got sick, of course he did. He developed a chest cold that turned into pneumonia. He could not work, he could not earn money, and he could not afford a doctor. He tried to redeem his coat from the pawn shop, but he did not have the money to buy it back. The pawn shop sold it to someone else. Henry spent 3 months struggling with his health, struggling to find work, struggling to survive, and all because he had prioritized a superstition over his own practical needs. The money in his pocket on New Year's Day did not make him wealthy. It made him vulnerable. It made him sick. It almost killed him. By April, Henry had recovered enough to work again. He found a new job. He saved enough money to buy another coat, but the experience left him bitter, angry. He felt like he had been tricked, like the superstition had betrayed him, and he vowed never to believe in such things again. But here is the tragic part. There are records indicating that Henry, despite his vow, despite his bitter experience, still made sure he had money in his pocket on the next New Year's Day. Because even though he knew, intellectually, that the superstition was nonsense, he could not shake the fear, the what if, the possibility that maybe, just maybe, it was real. And he could not risk another year of suffering. This is the power of superstition. It does not have to make sense. It does not have to have evidence. It just has to prey on fear. And once fear has taken root, logic has very little power to dislodge it. Now, let me talk about the class dimension of this superstition, because it reveals something ugly about Victorian society. Wealthy Victorians loved this tradition. They thought it was charming, quaint, a harmless bit of folklore. They would make sure their children had gold coins in their pockets on New Year's Day, not because they feared poverty, but because it was fun, because it was tradition, because they could afford to treat it as a game. But for poor Victorians, it was not a game. It was a source of genuine anxiety, a yearly crisis, a reminder that they did not have enough, that they were one step away from disaster, that even their pockets were not reliably full, and the wealthy did not understand this. They could not understand it, because they had never experienced the kind of poverty where a few coins represented a meaningful portion of your resources, where the decision to keep money in your pocket versus using it for food was an actual dilemma. There are accounts from Victorian moralists, well-meaning reformers who tried to discourage poor families from participating in financial superstitions. They would lecture them about thrift, about practicality, about the importance of using money wisely rather than wasting it on rituals. But they completely missed the point. They did not understand that for poor families the superstition was not a choice. It was a response to powerlessness, a desperate attempt to feel some control over a financial situation that felt utterly uncontrollable. If you cannot control whether you get sick, whether you lose your job, whether prices go up, whether your landlord raises the rent, what can you control? You can control what is in your pocket. You can control whether you participate in the ritual. You can control that one small thing, and so you do it. Not because you really believe it will work, but because doing nothing feels even worse. This is the psychology of magical thinking. It is not about belief in the magical. It is about the need to act, the need to feel like you are doing something, anything to improve your situation, even if that something makes no practical sense. And honestly, we still do this today, do we not? We have our own financial superstitions, our own rituals. We knock on wood when we talk about money. We carry lucky charms. We follow investment gurus who promise us secrets to wealth. We buy lottery tickets even though we know the odds are terrible. We engage in magical thinking about money all the time because money is one of the areas of life where we feel most powerless, most vulnerable, most anxious. The Victorians were not more irrational than we are. They were just more honest about their irrationality. They codified it into traditions. They made it public. They performed their financial anxiety in front of each other, instead of hiding it behind closed doors or anonymous online forums. By the early 20th century, the money pocket superstition started to fade. Not because people became less anxious about money, but because the nature of money itself changed. Paper currency became more common, checks became more common, people carried less physical money in general. The ritual lost its physical form, it became harder to perform. But the anxiety behind it never went away. We just express it differently now. We check our bank account balances obsessively. We worry about our credit scores. We compare ourselves to others on social media and feel inadequate when we see their wealth. The fear of poverty, the need to feel financially secure, that is still with us. We have just stopped pretending that carrying coins in our pockets will help. So the next time you feel anxious about money, the next time you engage in some small financial ritual or superstition, remember the Whitmore family choosing between feeding their children and satisfying tradition. Remember Henry Crawford pawning his coat in winter to have coins in his pocket. Remember all the Victorian families who went into debt, who made themselves poorer in a desperate attempt to ward off poverty through magical thinking, and ask yourself, what financial superstitions am I holding on to? What irrational beliefs about money am I letting control my behavior? Am I making decisions based on fear rather than logic? Am I prioritizing the appearance of security over actual security? Because that is the real lesson here. Superstitions about money do not create wealth. They create the illusion of control. And sometimes that illusion costs us dearly. But you know what is fascinating? As irrational as the money pocket superstition was, there were other Victorian New Year's traditions that were even more bizarre, even more disconnected from reality. We're about to explore a set of superstitions that involve taking things in and out of your house, complicated rules about what you could and could not do on January 1st, restrictions so arbitrary and so numerous that Victorian families lived in constant fear of accidentally breaking one and dooming their entire year. These forbidden actions were everywhere, and the consequences for violating them, at least according to Victorian belief, were catastrophic. That is what we are exploring next. So stay with me, because the Victorian obsession with controlling fate through ritual is about to reach its peak of absurdity. Imagine waking up on January 1st and realizing that every single action you take for the next 24 hours could potentially curse your entire year. Not just the big actions, not just the important decisions, but everything. Every tiny movement, every mundane task, every thoughtless gesture, all of it suddenly matters. All of it carries weight. All of it could be the thing that destroys your fortune for the next 365 days. This was the reality for many Victorian families on New Year's Day. Because in addition to all the superstitions we have already discussed, there was a whole category of beliefs about forbidden actions, things you absolutely could not do on January 1st. And the list was so long, so detailed, so absurdly specific, that it turned what should have been a day of celebration into a day of paralyzing anxiety. Let me give you just a taste of these rules. On New Year's Day, you could not take anything out of your house without first bringing something in. You could not work. You could not wash clothes. You could not sweep the floor. You could not let the fire go out. You could not cry. You could not argue. You could not lend money. You could not pay debts. You could not kill anything, not even a fly. You could not break anything. You could not let a woman enter your house before a man. And in some regions, you could not even stay inside your house for too long because that meant you would be sickly and housebound all year. Do you see the problem? These rules contradicted each other. You had to go outside to avoid being trapped indoors all year, but you also had to make sure the right person entered your house first. You could not work, but you also had to maintain your fire, which was work. You could not take anything out without bringing something in, but what if you did not have anything to bring in? It was impossible, literally impossible, to follow all the rules perfectly. And yet Victorian families tried. They stressed themselves into knots trying to navigate this maze of superstitions. And when something inevitably went wrong during the year, they would look back at New Year's Day and try to figure out which rule they had broken, which mistake had cursed them. Let me tell you about the Parker family. They lived in Cornwall, England in 1887. John Parker was a fisherman. His wife Sarah managed the household. They had 3 children, and Sarah in particular was deeply superstitious. She had grown up learning all the New Year's rules from her mother, and she was determined to follow every single one of them. On New Year's Eve, 1886, Sarah spent hours preparing. She made lists. She planned out the entire next day. She arranged for a dark-haired male neighbour to visit first thing in the morning to be their first footer. She made sure every member of the family had a coin in their pocket. She swept the house thoroughly on December 31st so she would not have to sweep on January 1st. She prepared food in advance so she would not have to cook, which would be work. She even went so far as to tell her children that they could not cry on New Year's Day. No matter what happened, no tears, because crying on January 1st meant you would cry all year. She warned them sternly, she made them promise. January 1st arrived. Sarah woke up early, anxious and alert. The first footer came as planned. The morning went smoothly. But then, around noon, disaster struck. Sarah's youngest child, a 4-year-old boy named Thomas, was playing outside. He tripped, fell hard, scraped his knee badly. It was bleeding. It hurt. And he started to cry. Sarah heard the crying from inside the house. She ran outside. And instead of comforting her son, instead of checking his injury, she grabbed him by the shoulders and said, Stop crying right now. You cannot cry today. You will ruin everything." Little Thomas, already in pain, already frightened, now had his mother yelling at him to stop expressing his pain. He tried to stop, he really did, but he was 4 years old, his knee hurt, and he could not help it. He kept crying. Sarah panicked. She brought him inside. She bandaged his knee roughly, quickly, and then she spent the rest of the day in a state of dread, convinced that her son's tears had cursed the family, convinced that they would now experience sorrow all year long. And you know what? They did experience hardship that year. John's fishing boat was damaged in a storm. They lost income. One of the other children got sick. They had to spend money on medicine. By the end of 1887, the family was struggling financially. But here is the question. Were those hardships caused by a 4-year-old boy crying on New Year's Day? Or were they just normal life events, the kind of setbacks that fishing families in Cornwall experienced all the time? Of course it was the latter, but Sarah never saw it that way. She blamed herself, she blamed her son. She believed that if only she had been more careful, if only she had prevented Thomas from falling, if only she had somehow stopped his tears, the year would have been different. This is the cruelty of these superstitions. They turn ordinary misfortunes into personal failures. They make you believe that you had control over things you never actually controlled. They create guilt where no guilt should exist. And the impact on little Thomas was significant. He grew up believing that his tears on New Year's Day had hurt his family, that his pain, his natural childish reaction to injury, had been a mistake. He internalized the message that expressing emotion was dangerous, that showing vulnerability could curse the people you loved. Can you imagine growing up with that weight? Let me tell you about another case, a woman named Elizabeth Hartley in Yorkshire, 1891. Elizabeth was meticulous, organised. She prided herself on running an efficient household, and she knew all the New Year's superstitions. She was determined to follow them. One of the rules she knew was that you could not let anything leave your house on New Year's Day before something came in. So she planned accordingly. She would wait for the first footer to arrive with his gifts. Then and only then would she allow anything to be taken out. But on January 1st, 1891, something unexpected happened. Early in the morning, before the first footer arrived, Elizabeth's husband woke up feeling unwell. Very unwell. He needed to vomit. And he needed to do it outside because they did not have indoor plumbing. He needed to go out the door. Elizabeth faced a choice. Let her husband go outside, which would mean something leaving the house before something came in, thus breaking the rule and potentially cursing the year, or keep him inside, which would be inhumane and possibly dangerous to his health. She chose the superstition. She told her husband he had to wait. He could not go outside yet. He had to hold it in, just for a little while, just until the first footer arrived. Her husband, sick and desperate, argued with her, but Elizabeth was adamant. The rule could not be broken. They would be cursed. Their year would be ruined. He had to wait. Finally, after what must have been an agonizing 15 minutes, the first footer arrived. He entered the house with his gifts, and only then did Elizabeth allow her husband to rush outside and relieve himself. Her husband was furious, humiliated, angry that his wife had prioritized a superstition over his immediate physical needs. They had their first major argument of the year on New Year's Day, which ironically was also forbidden according to the Superstitions. Arguments on January 1st meant you would argue all year, and they did argue, frequently, throughout 1891, not because of any curse, but because that New Year's Day incident had created real resentment, real damage to their relationship. Elizabeth had shown her husband that she valued tradition more than his dignity, and he never quite forgave her for it. This is what these superstitions did. They forced people into impossible situations. They made people choose between kindness and tradition, between logic and fear, between their humanity and their desperate need to feel some control over the future. Now, let me talk about the rule that you could not work on New Year's Day. This one sounds reasonable at first. Who wants to work on a holiday? But here is the problem. What counts as work? If you are a farmer and your animals need to be fed, is that work? If you are a mother and your baby needs to be changed, is that work? If you are anyone who needs to cook a meal, clean up a spill, mend a torn piece of clothing, is that work? The answer was unclear, and different families interpreted the rule differently. Some families took it to an extreme. They would do absolutely nothing on January 1st. They would sit in their parlours all day, barely moving, afraid that any productive action would count as work and doom them to labour all year. There is an account from a doctor in Scotland, written in his medical journal in January of 1888. He describes being called to a house where an elderly woman had fallen and possibly broken her hip. When he arrived, he found that the fall had happened that morning on New Year's Day, but the family had not sent for him immediately. They had waited for hours, because calling for a doctor, getting help, dealing with a medical emergency, all of that felt like work, like productive activity, and they were afraid to break the rule. By the time the doctor arrived, the woman was in terrible pain. She'd been lying on the floor for 6 hours. 6 hours. Because her family was more afraid of a superstition than they were of her suffering. The doctor was appalled. He wrote in his journal that he wished he could make people understand that superstitions like this caused real harm, that they prevented people from acting in their own best interests, that they created suffering in the name of avoiding suffering. But his words fell on deaf ears, because the people who believed in these superstitions believed in them deeply. They believed that breaking the rules would cause worse suffering than following them ever could. They believed that 6 hours of pain was better than a year of cursed misfortune. This is the logic of fear. It is not rational. It does not weigh costs and benefits accurately. It just reacts. It avoids. It sacrifices the present to protect an imagined future. Now, you might be wondering, did anyone push back against these rules? Did anyone question them? And the answer is yes. There were people, educated people, doctors and teachers and reformers, who spoke out against Victorian superstitions, who tried to explain that these beliefs were not based in reality, that they were harming people more than helping them. But here is what made it so difficult to change these traditions. They were not just individual beliefs, they were community expectations. If you lived in a village where everyone followed the New Year's rules and you decided not to follow them, you were not just breaking with superstition, you were breaking with your community. You were marking yourself as different, as rebellious, as someone who did not respect tradition. And in tight-knit Victorian communities, that kind of social deviation came with real consequences. People would gossip about you. They would judge you. They might even ostracize you. So even if you did not believe in the superstitions yourself, you often had to pretend that you did. You had to follow the rules publicly, even if you privately thought they were nonsense. This is the power of social pressure. It can make people do things they know are irrational. It can make people sacrifice their own well-being and the well-being of their loved ones, just to fit in, just to avoid judgment. And honestly, we are still susceptible to this kind of pressure today, are we not? How many things do we do, not because we believe in them, but because everyone around us is doing them? How many traditions do we follow, not because they make sense, but because it would be awkward or difficult to stop? How many times have we sacrificed our own comfort, our own needs, our own better judgment, just to avoid standing out. The Victorians were not weaker than we are. They were not more easily influenced. They were just living in a time when social pressure was more visible, more explicit, more tied to concrete traditions. We face the same pressures. We just face them in different forms. By the early 20th century, many of these forbidden action superstitions started to fade. Not all at once, not everywhere, but gradually. As people moved from rural villages to cities, as communities became less tight-knit, as social pressure loosened, as education spread and people learned to question tradition more openly. But the impulse behind them, the desire to follow rules that promised to keep us safe, that desire never went away. We still have our forbidden actions, we still have our rules about what we should and should not do. We still judge ourselves and others based on adherence to traditions that may or may not make any actual sense. So the next time you find yourself following a rule without questioning it, the next time you feel social pressure to do something that goes against your better judgment, remember Sarah Parker yelling at her 4-year-old son to stop crying. Remember Elizabeth Hartley forcing her sick husband to wait. Remember the Scottish family letting their elderly mother suffer for 6 hours because they were afraid to break a superstition. Remember that traditions are not sacred just because they are old, that rules are not wise just because everyone follows them. That sometimes the kindest thing you can do is to break with expectation and do what is actually right, even if it makes you different, even if it makes you uncomfortable, even if everyone around you thinks you are wrong, because that is courage, that is growth. That is the ability to think for yourself instead of just inheriting fear from previous generations. But you know what might surprise you? As restrictive and anxiety-inducing as these forbidden action rules were, there was another category of Victorian New Year's superstition that was even more bizarre, even more elaborate, even more disconnected from any kind of logic. We are about to explore the world of Victorian New Year's food superstitions, the grotesque pies, the symbolic meals, the elaborate dishes that were supposed to bring good fortune but often just brought indigestion and horror. And some of these food traditions were not just strange. They were genuinely disgusting. They were culinary nightmares that people forced themselves to eat in the name of good luck. That story is coming up next, and I promise you it is gonna make you grateful for whatever you ate last New Year's. What if I told you that some Victorian families believed the key to a prosperous year was eating something so disgusting, so elaborately horrific that modern people would probably vomit just looking at it? What if I told you that this culinary monstrosity was not some obscure practice limited to a few eccentric individuals, but a recognized tradition documented in cookbooks and household guides? What if I told you that wealthy Victorians would spend days preparing this dish, would invite guests to witness it, would take pride in serving something that looked like it came from a nightmare? Welcome to the world of the Victorian New Year's pie, and I promise you this is going to be worse than you are imagining. Let me start by describing what this thing actually was. The most extreme version, documented by a woman named Mrs. Bliss in her cookbook, involved taking a boiled cow's tongue. That is step 1. A cow's tongue, boiled, still identifiable as a tongue, and then you stuff that tongue inside a chicken, a whole chicken, which you then stuff inside a duck, which you then stuff inside a turkey, which you then stuff inside a goose. 5 animals nested inside each other like the world's most disturbing set of Russian dolls. And then, just to make it even more revolting, you coat the entire thing in a jelly made from boiled cow's feet. Beef feet gelatin, covering everything. Now, take a moment and really picture that. A cow's tongue visible through translucent layers of poultry all encased in wobbly, gelatinous foot jelly on your dinner table on New Year's Day, and you're expected to eat it with a smile while telling everyone how delicious it is and how this meal will ensure your family's prosperity for the entire year. Can you imagine? Can you actually imagine sitting down to that meal? But here is the thing that makes this even more disturbing. This was not presented as a joke. This was not some Victorian version of a dare or a prank. This was a legitimate status symbol. If you could afford to make this pie, if you had access to 5 different animals plus cow's feet for gelatin, it meant you were wealthy. It meant you had abundance. It meant you could literally afford to be wasteful and excessive because you had so much. The symbolism was clear. We have so much food, so much variety, so much wealth, that we can combine all of these animals into one absurd dish. We can be ridiculous with our resources because we have resources to be ridiculous with. And that display of excess, that performance of abundance, was supposed to attract more abundance, to signal to fate or God or the universe that we were people who deserved continued prosperity. But let me tell you what happened when normal families who were not wealthy, tried to participate in this tradition, because that is where it gets tragic. There is a documented account from a family in the Midlands, England, in 1874. The family name was Greenwood. Robert Greenwood was a clerk. His wife Anne managed the household. They were middle class, comfortable but not wealthy. They had enough to get by, but luxuries were rare. Anne had heard about the New Year's pie tradition. She had read about it in a ladies' magazine, and she desperately wanted to make one for her family. She wanted to prove that they were successful, that they were moving up in the world, that they could afford the same elaborate traditions as the wealthy families she read about. But she could not afford 5 different animals. She could barely afford one, so she improvised. She bought a small chicken. She stuffed it with as much cheap meat as she could find, scraps, offcuts, things that were affordable, and she tried to create a jelly coating using whatever ingredients she had available. It was not beef feet gelatin. It was something cheaper, something that did not set properly. On New Year's Day, 1874, Anne presented her pie to the family with enormous pride. She had worked for 2 days preparing it. She had spent a significant portion of the family's food budget on ingredients. She had sacrificed other meals, other necessities to make this one elaborate dish. And it was awful. Not just unappetizing, genuinely bad. The jelly was runny and strange tasting. The meat inside was overcooked and dry. The whole thing looked more sad than impressive, more pathetic than prosperous. Her husband tried to eat it politely. Her children, less diplomatic, refused. They said it smelled bad. They said they did not want it. Anne, devastated, spent the rest of the day in tears. She had wanted so badly to participate in this tradition, to prove her family's worth, and instead she had created something that her own family could not even eat. The emotional toll was significant. Anne felt like a failure, like she had doomed her family's year by serving a bad version of the prosperity pie. She became depressed, withdrawn. And the family's year, 1874, was indeed difficult, not because of any curse, but because Anne's depression affected her ability to manage the household. Her inability to move past this perceived failure created real problems. This is what happens when status symbols become spiritual requirements, when displays of wealth become confused with guarantees of fortune. People who cannot afford to participate feel excluded, inferior, desperate to prove themselves, and they make sacrifices that hurt them more than help them. Now, let me talk about the people who could afford this pie. The wealthy Victorians who made it correctly, who served it proudly, who treated it as a centerpiece of their New Year's celebration. Because even for them, even when done right, this dish was problematic. There are accounts of guests at Victorian New Year's dinners being physically ill after eating the pie. The combination of so many different meats, all cooked together, all coated in gelatin, was simply too rich, too heavy, too much for the human digestive system to handle comfortably. People would eat it out of politeness, out of tradition, and then spend the rest of the evening or the next day feeling terrible. One Victorian doctor, writing in his personal correspondence in 1889, describes being invited to a New Year's dinner where the grotesque pie was served. He writes, and I am paraphrasing, that he felt obligated to eat a portion out of respect for his host, but that he regretted it immediately. He describes the texture as unpleasant, the flavour as overwhelming, and the aftermath as deeply uncomfortable. He writes that he wished people would abandon such elaborate and unhealthy traditions in favour of simpler, more reasonable meals, but his opinion was in the minority. Because for most wealthy Victorians the discomfort was worth it, the status was worth it, the tradition was worth it. They would rather suffer through indigestion than admit that maybe, just maybe, this whole thing was a bad idea. And that is the power of tradition. Once something becomes established as the correct way to do things, it takes tremendous courage to say, actually, this is terrible and we should stop. Because stopping means admitting that all the previous years were wrong, that all the effort and expense and suffering were for nothing, and humans hate admitting that. We hate accepting that we have been doing something pointless or harmful, so we double down, we keep doing it, we convince ourselves it is worth it. Now, not every family attempted the full 5-animal monstrosity. Some families scaled it down. They would do a turducken-style dish with just 2 or 3 birds. They would skip the gelatin coating. They would modify the recipe to make it more palatable, more affordable, more reasonable. But even the modified versions carried the same symbolic weight. You were still combining multiple animals into one dish. You were still displaying abundance. You were still participating in a tradition that said, look how much we have, therefore we will continue to have much. And here is the question I want to pose to you. Did it work? Did eating this elaborate, expensive, often disgusting meal actually bring prosperity to the families who consumed it? Of course not. Financial success has nothing to do with what you eat on New Year's Day. It has to do with employment opportunities, health, economic conditions, luck, timing, and 1,000 other factors that have nothing to do with whether you stuffed a cow's tongue inside multiple birds. But the families who did well financially that year believed it worked. They attributed their success to the tradition. They said, see, we ate the prosperity pie and we prospered, and they would do it again the next year. And the families who did not do well financially that year, they blamed themselves. They said, we must not have done it right. We must have made a mistake in the preparation. We must have offended the tradition somehow. And they would try even harder the next year. Spend even more money. Make the dish even more elaborate. This is survivorship bias. When a tradition is followed by both successful and unsuccessful people, the successful people attribute their success to the tradition, while the unsuccessful people attribute their failure to not following the tradition correctly. The tradition can never be disproven because any outcome can be interpreted as supporting it. Let me tell you about one more case. A wealthy family in London, 1892. The family name was Ashford. Charles Ashford was a banker. His wife Beatrice was a socialite. They had money, real money, and they hosted an elaborate New Year's dinner every year. The grotesque pie was always the centerpiece. In January of 1892, Beatrice outdid herself. She hired a professional chef. She sourced the finest ingredients. She created a pie that was, by all accounts, a masterpiece of the genre. 5 animals, perfect gelatin coating, elaborate garnishes. It looked exactly like it was supposed to look. But when it was time to serve it, when the guests gathered around and the pie was cut open, something went wrong. The smell that emerged was not appetizing. It was off, slightly rancid. Something about the combination of meats, or the way they'd been prepared, or the temperature they had been stored at, had created a situation where the food was not safe to eat. Beatrice, horrified and embarrassed, tried to salvage the situation. She insisted the smell was normal. She encouraged people to eat. A few polite guests took small portions, but most people declined. The evening was ruined. The status symbol had become a source of shame. And the worst part, several of the guests who did eat portions of the pie became ill. Food poisoning, vomiting, fever. One elderly guest was sick for over a week. He nearly died. Charles and Beatrice spent the rest of 1892 dealing with the fallout. Their reputation was damaged. People gossiped about the disastrous dinner. They lost social standing. And ironically, Charles's banking business suffered that year because potential clients had heard about the New Year's dinner disaster and wondered if it reflected poorly on his judgment. So the very tradition that was supposed to bring prosperity and demonstrate abundance had caused embarrassment, illness, and financial harm. But did the Ashfords abandon the tradition? Did they say, maybe this is not a good idea? No, and the next year they tried again. They were even more careful. They were determined to redeem themselves, because admitting the tradition itself was flawed would have been too painful, too humiliating. This is the sunken cost fallacy. Once you have invested time, money, and emotional energy into something, it becomes incredibly difficult to walk away. Even when it is clearly not working, even when it is actively harming you. You keep investing because admitting you were wrong feels worse than continuing to suffer. By the early 20th century, the grotesque pie tradition had mostly died out. Not because people suddenly realized it was ridiculous, but because tastes changed. Food culture evolved. People started favoring simpler, more elegant dishes. The Edwardian era brought a different aesthetic, and the elaborate, grotesque displays of the Victorian era fell out of fashion. But the impulse behind them, the desire to demonstrate prosperity through consumption, that never went away. We still do it. We just do it differently. We post pictures of expensive meals on social media. We compete over who has the most elaborate holiday spread. We spend money we do not have on impressive food displays because we want others to think we're doing well. The Victorians stuffed cows' tongues into geese. We order overpriced artisanal everything and photograph it for Instagram. The medium has changed. The psychology has not. So the next time you find yourself spending more than you should on food to impress others, the next time you stress over creating the perfect holiday meal, the next time you worry that your dinner table is not impressive enough, remember Anne Greenwood crying over her failed pie. Remember the Victorian guests vomiting after eating too much rich meat. Remember the Ashfords poisoning their friends in pursuit of status. And ask yourself, who am I doing this for? Is this actually bringing me joy? Or am I just performing prosperity? Am I feeding my loved ones, or am I feeding my ego? Am I creating memories, or am I creating stress? Because food is meant to nourish, to connect, to bring pleasure. It is not meant to be a status symbol. It is not meant to be a source of anxiety. It is not meant to prove anything to anyone. But you know what? Food was not the only thing Victorians turned into a superstitious nightmare on New Year's. There was another category of beliefs that was equally strange, equally elaborate, and equally disconnected from reality. We are about to dive into the world of Victorian New Year's symbolism. The pigs and clovers, the bizarre postcards, the dark imagery that appeared on greeting cards, the ways that Victorians tried to communicate good wishes while simultaneously revealing their deep obsession with death and mortality. That is what comes next, and trust me, when you see some of these New Year's cards, when you understand the symbolism they used, you are going to realize that Victorian New Year's was not just superstitious, it was deeply, darkly, morbidly strange in ways that modern people struggle to comprehend. If you thought the food was strange, wait until you see what Victorians put on their New Year's greeting cards. Because while we send cards with champagne glasses and fireworks and cheerful wishes, Victorians sent cards with dead birds, mischievous monkeys, gun-toting dogs, and perhaps most disturbingly images of children being samped with the date of the passing year and thrown into cauldrons to be made into soup. Yes, soup, made from children, on greeting cards, that people sent to their friends and family to wish them a happy new year, Welcome to the bizarre world of Victorian New Year's symbolism, where nothing made sense, where darkness and celebration mix together in ways that modern people find deeply unsettling, where the imagery of good fortune was often indistinguishable from the imagery of death. Let me start with the pigs and clovers, because these two symbols appeared on Victorian New Year's cards constantly. You could not escape them. Almost every card featured either a pig, a clover, or both. And if you were lucky, you might get a card with a pig holding a clover in its mouth. Maximum good luck, maximum probability of prosperity, maximum symbolism. But why pigs? Why were pigs considered symbols of good fortune? The answer takes us deep into Victorian agricultural culture and the obsession with size. You see, during the 19th century, there were significant advances in livestock breeding. Farmers figured out how to make animals bigger, fatter, more productive, and there was a competitive element to it. Wealthy landowners would brag about the size of their cattle and pigs. They would hold competitions, they would commission paintings of their prize animals, and pigs, in particular, became symbols of abundance. A fat pig meant you had been feeding it well, which meant you had resources, which meant you were prosperous. So a pig on a New Year's card was essentially saying, may you be as fat and well-fed as this pig, may your resources be abundant, may your larder never be empty. Now, to modern sensibilities, this is a bit insulting, right? We do not want to be compared to pigs. But in Victorian times, when food scarcity was a real concern, when many people genuinely worried about going hungry, the pig was not an insult. It was aspiration. It represented security, survival, the ability to not just survive but to thrive. Clovers, especially four-leaf clovers, had been symbols of luck for centuries. The rarity made them special. Finding one meant you'd been blessed by chance, and anything blessed by chance could, theoretically, continue to be blessed. So clovers on New Year's cards represented hope, the hope that random good fortune would find you in the coming year. But here is where Victorian New Year's cards get truly weird. Because pigs and clovers were the wholesome symbols, they made sense, they were cheerful, but alongside these hopeful images, Victorians also included imagery that was dark, morbid, sometimes downright disturbing. Dead birds were a common motif, not just any dead birds, specifically robins. Little red-breasted birds, frozen or lifeless, surrounded by snow. Now you might think, well, that is sad. That is a symbol of winter's harshness. But it gets stranger. These dead robin cards were not meant to be depressing. They were considered good luck, because the robin represented the old year dying, and its death was necessary for the new year to be born. Death and renewal, the cycle of life. Victorian New Year's cards were basically saying, something has to die for something new to live. Happy New Year. Can you imagine receiving that card today? Can you imagine opening your mailbox and finding a cheerful greeting with a picture of a dead bird and the message wishing you joy in the new year? You would think someone was threatening you, but Victorians saw nothing wrong with it. Death was part of life, and New Year's was about transition, about endings and beginnings, and sometimes endings had to be acknowledged explicitly. Then there were the cards with children. Now some of these were wholesome, children playing, children celebrating, but others were bizarre. The Kinney Tobacco Company, for example, produced a series of New Year's cards that showed children being stamped with dates, like livestock, like products, and then, in some versions, these dated children would be thrown into cauldrons to be made into soup for the new year. What was the symbolism supposed to be? The best interpretation historians have is that it represented time-consuming youth, the old year eating up the innocence of childhood. Or perhaps it was about the passage of time being inevitable and somewhat violent. Or maybe, and this is the darkest possibility, Victorians just thought it was funny. They had a different sense of humour, a darker sense of humour, and images that we find horrifying, they found amusing. There is a documented account from a woman named Clara Morrison who lived in Boston in the 1880s. She saved all her greeting cards in a scrapbook, and years later her granddaughter went through that scrapbook and wrote about her reactions. The granddaughter, writing in the 1920s, describes being shocked by some of the imagery. She writes about finding cards with dead animals, threatening messages, and bizarre depictions of violence. And she writes that when she asked her grandmother about these cards, Clara simply laughed. She said they were funny. She said people enjoyed them. She said the granddaughter was being too sensitive. This generational divide tells us something important. What one generation finds amusing or acceptable, another generation finds disturbing. The Victorians lived in a world where death was much more visible, where child mortality was high, where disease and accidents could take someone at any moment. They did not have the luxury of pretending death did not exist. So they incorporated it into their celebrations, they made it part of their humour. They domesticated it in a way by putting it on greeting cards and making jokes about it. This is what scholars call memento mori, the reminder of death, the acknowledgement of mortality, and it was everywhere in Victorian culture. Not just on New Year's cards, but in jewellery, in art, in literature. Victorians were obsessed with death in a way that modern Western culture finds uncomfortable. But here is the thing. By acknowledging death, by making it a regular part of their visual culture, Victorians were arguably more psychologically healthy than we are. They did not pretend that bad things did not happen. They did not hide death away. They faced it. They talked about it. They sent cards about it. We in the 21st century try very hard to pretend death does not exist. We hide it in hospitals and funeral homes. We use euphemisms. We avoid talking about it. We sanitize our imagery. We send cards with champagne and fireworks and happy faces. And then we wonder why we are so anxious, why we are so afraid, why mortality feels like such a shocking, traumatic concept when it finally touches our lives. Maybe the Victorians, for all their strangeness, had something figured out. Maybe by acknowledging darkness, they made room for genuine joy. Maybe by accepting that death was part of life, they appreciated life more fully. Now, let me tell you about a specific tradition that combined prosperity symbolism with Victorian strangeness. The peppermint pig. This was a candy creation from Saratoga Springs, New York, invented by a candy maker named Jim Mangay in the 1880s. It was a small pig made entirely of peppermint candy, and the tradition went like this. On Christmas Eve after dinner, the family would gather. The peppermint pig would be placed in a cloth bag, and then each family member would take turns hitting the bag with a small hammer, breaking the pig into pieces. As they hit the pig, each person was supposed to say aloud the best things that had happened to them in the past year. The breaking of the pig was symbolic. It was releasing the good fortune of the past year so it could multiply in the year to come. And then everyone would eat the pieces of broken peppermint candy. Now, on the surface, this sounds charming, a bit whimsical, a sweet tradition for families, but think about the imagery for a moment. You are teaching children to hit a pig with a hammer, to break it into pieces, to celebrate good fortune by destroying a symbol of prosperity. The mixed messages are fascinating. Is the pig the prosperity you are trying to attract? Or is it the prosperity you already have that needs to be broken and shared? Is the act of destruction generative, or is it just violent? And yet families loved this tradition. It became so popular that peppermint pigs sold out every year. They were manufactured in large quantities. They were shipped all over the country, and people genuinely believed that this ritual of breaking a candy pig would bring them good luck. The peppermint pig tradition faded in the early 20th century. It was revived briefly in the 1960s and 1970s, and then it came back again around 2017, becoming trendy once more. which tells us something interesting. These strange traditions never really die, they just hibernate. And then, decades or centuries later, someone discovers them and thinks, hey, that is quirky, that is fun, let us bring it back. And suddenly, a tradition that made no logical sense in the 1880s is being practiced again in the 21st century, still making no logical sense, but now marketed as vintage charm. Let me tell you about one family's experience with Victorian New Year's symbolism, the Henderson family in Philadelphia, 1886. Margaret Henderson was an enthusiastic participant in all Victorian traditions. She collected New Year's cards, she bought peppermint pigs, she decorated her home with images of clovers and pigs. She fully embraced the symbolism. On New Year's Day, 1886, Margaret displayed all her New Year's cards on the mantelpiece. She had dozens of them. Friends and family had sent her their wishes, and among those cards was one with a particularly dark image. It showed a figure, possibly death or time personified, wielding a scythe over a group of people. The caption read something like, "The old year ends and takes with it all that was." Margaret's youngest daughter Emily, who was 7 years old, became fixated on this card. She asked her mother what it meant. Why was there a scary figure with a weapon on a happy greeting card? Margaret tried to explain. She said it was symbolic. It was about time passing. It was not meant to be frightening. But Emily had nightmares about it. For weeks, she would wake up crying, saying she had dreamed about the man with the scythe. She was terrified that time was going to cut her down, that the new year would take her away like it had taken the old year. Margaret, finally realizing the psychological impact, removed the card. She tried to comfort her daughter, but the damage was done. Emily developed an anxiety about New Year's that lasted into her adulthood. She associated the holiday with fear, with death, with loss, all because of a greeting card that her mother's generation found perfectly normal. This is the unintended consequence of normalizing dark imagery. Most adults could handle it. Most adults understood the symbolism and did not take it literally. But children saw pictures of death and violence and cauldrons of soup made from children, and they internalized different messages. They had nightmares. They developed fears. They learned that celebration and darkness were intertwined in confusing ways. By the Edwardian era and into the early 20th century, New Year's card imagery started to lighten. Dead birds disappeared. Violent imagery faded. The cards became more like what we are familiar with today. Cheerful, bright, forward-looking, the darkness was gradually removed. But the symbols of prosperity, the pigs and clovers, those stuck around longer. You can still find vintage New Year's cards from the 1910s and 1920s with pigs on them. The symbolism had staying power because it was less disturbing. It were weird, yes, but it was not traumatizing. And honestly, there is something almost endearing about the Victorian obsession with pig imagery. It is so specific, so tied to their particular moment in history, so reflective of their values and anxieties. They genuinely believed that putting a picture of a fat pig on a card would help their friends be prosperous. They believed it so much that they created an entire industry around it. We do not have pigs on our New Year's cards anymore, but we have our own symbols that future generations will probably find bizarre. We have our champagne glasses and party hats and fireworks. We have our hashtags and Instagram posts and carefully curated images of celebration. And 100 years from now, people will look back at our traditions and think, why did they care so much about posting pictures of their parties online? Why did they need digital validation for their celebrations? Why did they turn New Year's into a performance? Every generation has its strangeness. Every era has its bizarre rituals. The Victorians had dead birds and peppermint pigs. We have social media and FOMO and the pressure to have the perfect New Year's Eve. The medium changes, the underlying psychology, the need to mark transitions, to feel like we are doing it right. To participate in shared cultural rituals, that stays the same. So the next time you send a New Year's greeting, the next time you wish someone good fortune, remember the Victorian who sent a card with a dead robin and genuinely meant well. Remember Clara Morrison who thought those dark cards were funny. Remember little Emily Henderson who had nightmares about the man with the scythe. Remember that symbols mean different things to different people, and that what we find normal, future generations might find incomprehensible. But you know what? We are not done yet, because there is one final category of Victorian New Year's superstition that we have not talked about. One last tradition that encapsulates everything we have discussed. The fear, the control, the desperation, the darkness, the hope. And this tradition involves viewing New Year's Eve itself as a kind of death, a funeral for the old year, a memorial service for time that has passed. And the way Victorians mourned the old year, the way they said goodbye to what had been, reveals something profound about how they understood time, mortality, and the human condition. That is what we are exploring next, and I promise you it is going to tie everything together in a way that will make you see New Year's differently forever. There is something profound that happens when you treat time as a living thing, when you personify the year, when you give it a face, a personality, a lifespan. Because once you do that, once you make time into a character in your story, you have to deal with its death. And for the Victorians, that death was real, visceral, something to be mourned. New Year's Eve was not just a party, it was a funeral, a memorial service for something that had lived and was now passing away forever. Poets wrote elegies for the dying year. Preachers delivered sermons about mortality and the fleeting nature of existence. Families gathered not to celebrate but to grieve, to say goodbye, to acknowledge that something precious was ending and could never be recovered. And in that grief, in that acknowledgement of loss, the Victorians revealed something important about how they understood life itself. Let me read you part of a poem by Alfred Tennyson, one of the most famous poets of the Victorian era. It is called The Death of the Old Year, and it was written to be read on New Year's Eve. Listen to the tone, listen to the imagery. Old year, you shall not die. We did so laugh and cry with you. I have half a mind to die with you, old year, if you must die. He will not see the dawn of day. He lies upon his deathbed. The old year is dying in the night. Ring out wild bells to the wild sky. Ring out the old, ring in the new. Can you hear it? Can you hear the grief, the resistance to letting go, the personification of the year as someone who is literally dying in the night? This was not metaphor for the Victorians. This was how they actually felt. They believed the old year was a living entity that was dying, and that death deserved recognition, mourning, respect. Now, you might be thinking, well, that is just poetic language, just artistic expression, but it went deeper than that. Victorian preachers, particularly in Methodist and other nonconformist churches, actively encouraged people to treat New Year's Eve as a meditation on death, not just the death of the year, but their own mortality, their own inevitable end. There was a tradition called watch night services. These were religious gatherings that lasted from late evening until midnight. And they were not joyful. They were somber, reflective. People would sit in church pews for hours, listening to sermons about the shortness of life, the certainty of death, the need to live righteously because you never knew if you would see another new year. John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, started this tradition in the 1700s specifically as an alternative to the drinking and revelry that typically happened on New Year's Eve. He wanted people to spend their time contemplating mortality instead of celebrating. And his approach was successful. By the Victorian era, watch night services were common across Britain and America. Thousands of people chose to spend New Year's Eve in church thinking about death. Let me tell you about a specific watch night service that was documented by a journalist in London, 1885. The journalist, whose name was Edward Thompson, attended a Methodist church in the East End. He went out of curiosity, wanting to understand why people would choose this over a party. He describes the atmosphere as heavy, oppressive even. The church was packed, families with children, elderly people, young couples, all sitting in silence or singing hymns in minor keys. The preacher stood at the pulpit and spoke for nearly 2 hours about the transience of life, about how many people in that room would not live to see the next New Year's Eve, about how death could come at any moment, about how the old year was dying, just as they would all die someday, and they needed to be ready. Edward writes that by the time midnight approached, many people in the congregation were crying, not from joy, not from hope, but from genuine grief, from the weight of contemplating their own mortality, from the fear that they had wasted the year that was ending, from the anxiety about whether they would survive the year that was beginning. And then, at midnight, the bells rang, and the preacher's tone shifted. He began talking about resurrection, about renewal, about how death was not the end but a transformation, and the grief in the room slowly transformed into something like relief, like acceptance. The congregation sang Auld Lang Syne, but not in the cheerful way we sing it today, in a mournful way, as a goodbye to what had been, as a farewell to the dead year. Edward writes that he'd left the service feeling disturbed. He had expected something uplifting, something hopeful, but instead he had witnessed what felt like a collective confrontation with mortality, and he wondered if this was psychologically healthy, if spending New Year's Eve meditating on death was helpful or harmful. And that is the question, is it not? Was this Victorian approach to New Year's better than ours, more honest, more mature, or was it needlessly morbid, unnecessarily dark, a way of turning a celebration into a trauma? I think the answer is complicated, because on one hand, the Victorian willingness to face death, to talk about it openly, to incorporate it into their celebrations, probably made them less afraid of it. When you confront something regularly, when you normalize it, it loses some of its power to terrorize you. Victorian children grew up hearing about death constantly. They saw it on greeting cards, they heard about it in church, they experienced it in their families because mortality rates were so much higher. And that familiarity, while sad, probably made death less of a shocking, unthinkable event. On the other hand, there is something to be said for choosing joy, for deciding that even though death is real, even though time passes and cannot be recovered, we can still choose to focus on what we have rather than what we have lost. We can still choose to celebrate the present rather than mourn the past. The Victorians struggled with this balance. They wanted to acknowledge darkness while also hoping for light. They wanted to grieve while also moving forward. And their New Year's traditions reflected that struggle. They were simultaneously celebrating and mourning, welcoming and grieving, looking forward and looking back. Let me tell you about a family that tried to navigate this tension. The Kingsley family in Devon, England, 1877. Frederick Kingsley was a school teacher. His wife Ruth was deeply religious. They had 5 children, and every New Year's Eve they held a family ritual that combined both grief and hope. The ritual went like this. After dinner, the family would gather in the parlour. Frederick would read aloud from a journal he kept all year, noting significant events, births, deaths, illnesses, achievements, failures, everything that had happened to the family over the past 12 months. And as he read, each family member was encouraged to share how they felt about those events, what they regretted, what they were grateful for, what they wished they had done differently. This part of the ritual was heavy, emotional. There were always tears, because inevitably the year had contained loss, friends who had died, opportunities that had been missed, conflicts that had not been resolved. Frederick would read these entries and the family would sit with them, would acknowledge them, would give them weight. But then, after the grief, came the second part of the ritual. Each family member would write down one hope for the coming year, Not a resolution, not a goal, just a hope, something they wished for, something they wanted to see happen. These hopes were placed in a box, and the box was sealed until the next New Year's Eve, when they would open it and see which hopes had come true and which had not. This ritual was the Kingsley family's way of honouring both the death of the old year and the birth of the new. They did not ignore the darkness. They did not pretend that nothing bad had happened. But they also did not wallow in grief. They acknowledged it, gave it space, and then deliberately turned toward hope. Ruth Kingsley wrote about this tradition in letters to her sister, and in one letter from January of 1878, she reflects on why they do this ritual. She writes, and I am paraphrasing, that she believes it is important to teach her children that life contains both joy and sorrow, that time passes and cannot be stopped, that we will all die someday, but also that within the time we have we can choose how we respond. We can choose to honour what has been while still reaching for what might be. This is wisdom. This is maturity. This is a family that understood something profound about the human condition, that we are creatures who live in time, who experience loss, who must somehow find a way to keep going even when we know that everything we love will eventually end. Not all Victorian families achieved this balance. Some went too far into darkness. They became obsessed with death and loss and could not see past it. Some attended watch night services and left feeling more afraid of life than they had been before. Some spent New Year's Eve in such deep grief that they could not access joy even when it was offered to them. And other families went too far in the opposite direction. They ignored the darkness entirely. They threw elaborate parties and got drunk and pretended that time was not passing, that aging was not happening, that death was not real. And then, when death inevitably arrived, they were unprepared, shocked, devastated in ways they did not know how to process. The Victorians were trying to find a middle path, a way to live with the knowledge of mortality without being crushed by it, a way to celebrate life while also honouring its limits. And their New Year's traditions, for all their strangeness, for all their morbidity, were attempts at that navigation. By the early 20th century, the funeral atmosphere of New Year's Eve began to shift. The watch night services became less common. The mournful poems and sermons gave way to more hopeful messaging. The cultural emphasis moved from death and renewal to simply renewal. The death part was quietly dropped. This shift happened partly because mortality rates improved. Medical advances meant fewer people were dying young. Fewer families were experiencing the kind of regular, devastating loss that had been normal in the Victorian era. Death became less visible, less immediate, and as it receded from daily life, it also receded from cultural celebrations. We, in the 21st century, have almost completely removed death from our New Year's celebrations. We do not talk about the old year dying. We do not meditate on our own mortality. We do not sit in churches contemplating the shortness of life. We throw parties. We drink champagne. We count down to midnight with excitement, not grief. We focus entirely on forward motion, on new beginnings, on hope and possibility. And maybe that is better. Maybe it is healthier to celebrate without the weight of mortality hanging over everything. Maybe we have evolved past the need to confront death at every turn. Or maybe we have lost something. Maybe by removing death entirely from our celebrations, we have made it harder to deal with when it does arrive. Maybe by never practicing grief, by never sitting with loss, by never acknowledging endings, we have become less equipped to handle the inevitable tragedies of life. The Victorians were not perfect. Their obsession with death was sometimes excessive, sometimes harmful, sometimes traumatizing, especially for children. But they were trying to do something important. They were trying to integrate the reality of mortality into their understanding of life. They were trying to teach themselves and their children that endings are part of the story. That loss is not a failure but an inevitability. that we can acknowledge darkness without being consumed by it. So as we come to the end of this exploration of Victorian New Year's superstitions, as we prepare to look at the final piece of this puzzle, I want you to think about your own relationship with time, with endings, with mortality. Do you avoid thinking about it? Do you pretend it is not happening? Do you distract yourself with parties and noise and forward motion? Or do you make space for it? Do you acknowledge it? Do you sit with it even when it is uncomfortable? Because that is the real legacy of Victorian New Year's traditions. Not the specific rituals, not the superstitions, but the willingness to look directly at what frightens us, to name it, to incorporate it into our celebrations rather than hiding it away. The Victorians were strange, they were morbid, they were excessive, but they were also brave, and that bravery, that willingness to face the darkness, is something we could learn from. But there is one final layer to this story, one last piece that will tie everything together. Because after exploring all these superstitions, after seeing all the fear and anxiety and desperate attempts at control, we need to ask the ultimate question: what does all of this tell us about being human? What can we learn from the Victorians that applies to our lives today? How do we take this bizarre, fascinating, disturbing history and use it to understand ourselves better? That is what we're going to explore in our final section, and I promise you, it is going to change the way you think about tradition, about fear, and about the human need for meaning in a world that often feels meaningless. So stay with me for just a little longer, because the most important part is still ahead. So here we are, after exploring thresholds and first footers, after witnessing gentlemen callers drinking themselves into oblivion, after watching families sweep hot ashes and ride the stang, after tasting grotesque pies and reading morbid greeting cards, after sitting through funeral services for the dying year, we arrive at the most important question of all. What was all of this really about? Because it was not really about hair colour predicting fortune. It was not really about coins in pockets creating wealth. It was not really about cakes thrown at doors preventing hunger. The Victorians were not stupid. They were not more irrational than we are. They were not more superstitious in their nature. They were simply human. And humans, when faced with uncertainty, when confronted with a future they cannot control, when living in a world that feels chaotic and dangerous, will grasp at anything that offers even the illusion of control. That is what all of these superstitions were, attempts at control, desperate, sometimes beautiful, sometimes tragic attempts to feel like they had some power over their fate. And when you understand that, when you see these traditions not as quaint folklore but as psychological survival mechanisms, everything changes. The Victorian era was terrifying in ways we struggle to comprehend. Imagine living in a time when a simple cut could kill you through infection. When childbirth was one of the leading causes of death for women. When diseases we can now cure with antibiotics would wipe out entire families. When economic depressions could leave you homeless overnight. When there was no social safety net, no unemployment insurance, no welfare system. When your survival depended entirely on your ability to work, and one illness, one accident, one stroke of bad luck could destroy everything. In that context, the New Year's superstitions start to make sense. If you believe that having dark-haired man walk through your door first will bring good luck, and good luck might mean your children survive the winter, would you not make absolutely sure to arrange for that dark-haired man? If you believe that keeping money in your pocket will prevent poverty, and poverty might mean starvation, would you not sacrifice a meal to keep those coins? If you believe that sweeping ashes will remove last year's misfortunes, and those misfortunes included death and illness, would you not risk burning your house down to perform the ritual? These were not idle traditions, these were survival strategies. Flawed survival strategies, yes. Irrational survival strategies, certainly. but survival strategies nonetheless, and the fact that they did not actually work, the fact that hair colour and pocket money and swept ashes had no real impact on fortune did not matter, because the act of doing something, the feeling of having performed the right ritual, the sense that you had tried to protect yourself and your family, that provided psychological comfort. And sometimes psychological comfort is all we have. Now, you might be thinking, well, we have moved past all of that. We live in a modern world, we have science, we have medicine, we have social safety nets, we do not need superstitions anymore. And you would be partly right. We are safer than the Victorians were. We have more control over our lives than they did. But we are not free from uncertainty. We are not immune to fear. And we are not above grasping at rituals that make us feel like we have some power over the uncontrollable. Think about it. What are your New Year's traditions? Do you make resolutions? Do you write down goals? Do you perform certain actions on January 1st because you believe, even just a little bit, that they will influence your year? Do you avoid certain things? Do you seek out certain people? Do you have rituals, however small, that you tell yourself are just for fun, but you would feel uncomfortable skipping? We all do this. We all have our superstitions. We have just rebranded them. We call them traditions. We call them habits. We call them personal preferences. But at their core, they serve the same function as the Victorian superstitions. They give us a sense of agency. They let us feel like we are doing something to shape our future. They comfort us in the face of uncertainty, and there is nothing wrong with that. There is nothing wrong with wanting to feel some control. There is nothing wrong with rituals that bring us comfort. The problem only arises when the ritual starts to hurt us, when it causes more harm than the comfort it provides, when it traps us in patterns that do not serve us. The Victorians crossed that line constantly. They let their fear control them to the point where they made terrible decisions. They borrowed money they could not repay. They denied their children food. They delayed medical care. They destroyed relationships. They traumatized their kids. All in service of rituals that promised protection but delivered only more anxiety. And we do the same thing. Maybe not with the same rituals, maybe not to the same extreme, but we do it. We stress ourselves over perfect holiday celebrations. We go into debt to maintain appearances. We sacrifice our mental health to meet social expectations. We perform traditions we do not even enjoy because we are afraid of what it would mean to stop. We let fear, dressed up as custom, control our behaviour. So what do we do? How do we take the lesson of Victorian New Year's superstitions and apply it to our own lives? How do we find the balance between honouring tradition and living freely? Between acknowledging our fears and not being controlled by them? I think the answer lies in what we learned from the Kingsley family. Remember them? The family in Devon who had that beautiful ritual of reading their year's journal, grieving what had been lost, and then writing hopes for the future. They found the balance. They acknowledged darkness without being consumed by it. They honoured endings while still reaching toward beginnings. They created a tradition that served them rather than enslaving them. That is the key. Tradition should serve us. They should bring meaning, connection, comfort, joy. They should help us mark time, honour transitions, create memories. But the moment a tradition starts to cause more pain than it relieves, the moment it demands sacrifices that hurt us or our loved ones, the moment it stops serving us and we start serving it, that is when we need to question it. That is when we need the courage to say, this is not working anymore. This is not helping. This needs to change. And that courage is hard because tradition is powerful. Something under pressure is powerful. The fear of being different, of breaking with the past, of admitting that maybe our ancestors were wrong. All of that is incredibly powerful. The Victorians struggled with it. We struggle with it. Every generation struggles with it. But here is what I want you to remember. The Victorians who suffered the most were not the ones who broke tradition. They were the ones who followed it blindly. Thomas Wright, ostracised every New Year's Eve because of his red hair. Margaret Campbell, sitting with her door open all night in the freezing cold waiting for a first footer who never came. The Whitmore children crying from hunger while coins sat unused in their pockets. Little Thomas Parker, yelled at for crying when he was hurt. Elizabeth Hartley's husband, forced to wait while sick. Emily Henderson, traumatized by a greeting card. These people suffered because they or their families prioritized tradition over humanity. And the Victorians who found peace? They were the ones who adapted, who modified, who took the core meaning of a tradition and made it work for their specific circumstances, who had the courage to say, I understand why this tradition exists, I honour what it represents, but I am going to do it differently. I am going to make it mine. That is the real legacy of Victorian New Year's superstitions. Not the specific rituals, not the particular beliefs, but the eternal human struggle between our need for meaning and our need for freedom, between our desire to connect with the past and our need to live in the present, between our longing for certainty and our acceptance of chaos. The Victorians did not solve this struggle, no generation ever has, but they lived it fully. They showed us both the beauty and the danger of tradition. They demonstrated what happens when fear becomes ritual, when anxiety becomes custom, when the desperate need for control turns into elaborate performances that ultimately control us. And in showing us their struggles, they give us permission to examine our own, to question our own traditions, to ask ourselves, am I doing this because it brings me joy, or because I'm afraid to stop? Am I honouring the past, or am I trapped by it? Am I creating meaning, or am I performing meaninglessness? These are not easy questions, they are not comfortable questions, but they are necessary questions because life is short, time is limited, and we do not have the luxury of spending our precious years performing rituals that do not serve us, following traditions that harm us, sacrificing our well-being to satisfy the expectations of people who lived in a completely different world with completely different challenges. The Victorians teach us that tradition can be both beautiful and brutal, that rituals can comfort and cage, that the line between meaningful custom and destructive superstition is thinner than we like to admit, and that finding that line, walking that line, requires constant attention, constant questioning, and constant courage. So as we close this journey through Victorian New Year's superstitions, as we say goodbye to the threshold rituals and first footers, to the gentleman callers and hot ashes, to the grotesque pies and dark greeting cards, to the watch night services and dying years, I want to leave you with one final thought. You are not bound by tradition. You are not obligated to continue practices that do not serve you. You are not required to perform rituals that make you uncomfortable, that hurt you, that drain you. You have permission right now to examine every tradition in your life and ask, is this bringing me closer to the people I love? Is this creating joy? Is this adding meaning? And if the answer is no, you have permission to stop, to change, to create something new. The Victorians were trapped by their era, by their lack of knowledge, by their genuine fears of disease and poverty and death. But you are not trapped. You have options they never had. You have safety they never knew. You have freedom they could not imagine. Use it. Use it wisely. Use it courageously. Use it to build traditions that honour the past while serving the present. Use it to create rituals that connect you to others without imprisoning you. Use it to mark time, to celebrate transitions, to acknowledge endings and beginnings, but on your own terms, in your own way, with your own meaning. Because that is what the Victorians were trying to do, underneath all the superstition and fear. They were trying to make sense of existence, to create meaning in a world that often felt meaningless, to connect with something larger than themselves, to believe that their actions mattered, that their choices had weight, that they were not just passive victims of fate, but active participants in their own stories. And that impulse, that beautiful, very human impulse to create meaning, to seek connection, to mark the passage of time with intention and ritual, that is worth keeping, that is worth honouring, that is worth passing on to future generations. Not the specific superstitions, not the fear-based rituals, but the understanding that we are creatures who need meaning, who crave ritual, who long to feel connected to the past and hopeful about the future, and that there are healthy ways to meet those needs, ways that do not require us to sacrifice our children's meals, to burn our hands, to traumatize our loved ones, or to live in constant anxiety. The Victorians showed us what not to do, but in doing so they also showed us what to aim for. A life where tradition serves joy, where ritual creates connection, where the marking of time brings not fear but appreciation, where we can acknowledge that everything ends, including ourselves, without letting that knowledge paralyze us, where we can honor the past without being bound by it, where we can face the future without pretending we control it, where we can simply be human with all our need for meaning, all our longing for connection, all our fear of the unknown, and find ways to meet those needs that make us more alive, not less. That is the legacy I hope you take from this journey. Not the bizarre details, not the strange customs, but the deeper truth. That every tradition began as someone's attempt to cope with fear, that every ritual was once someone's desperate grasp at control, and that we have the power to take those impulses, those very human impulses, and transform them into something that actually serves us, something that actually brings joy, something that actually creates meaning. Thank you for staying with me through this long, strange, sometimes dark journey into Victorian New Year's superstitions. Thank you for your curiosity, for your willingness to look at the uncomfortable parts of history, for your openness to seeing yourself reflected in the fears of people who lived over a century ago. I hope this story has given you something to think about, something to feel, something to question in your own life. And I hope when your next New Year's arrives, when you find yourself performing whatever traditions you perform, you will remember the Victorians, remember their fear, remember their courage, remember their mistakes, remember their wisdom, and you will ask yourself, am I doing this from a place of fear or from a place of love? Am I performing to control the future or celebrating the present? Am I trapped by tradition or am I creating meaning? The answers to those questions, whatever they are, will guide you toward a life that is more authentic, more joyful, more free. And that, I think, is the greatest gift the Victorians can give us. Not their traditions, but the permission to examine ours. Not their certainty, but the courage to question. Not their answers, but the wisdom to keep asking. Until next time, take care of yourself, be kind to others, question your traditions, honor your humanity, and remember that you are not bound by the past. You are free to create new meanings, new rituals, new ways of marking time that serve the life you want to live, not the life fear tells you to live. I will see you in the next story, and trust me, it is going to be just as fascinating, just as strange, and just as revealing about what it means to be human. Until then, be well.